So we are live.
Okay. I want to call the, welcome everybody. I want to call the May 13th meeting of the Council of our School Board of Directors Finance Committee meeting to order. I am going to, in a moment, ask for the attendees here to go around and introduce themselves, but I just want to ask the attendees to, as we go through the meeting, please use your raise hand feature. Don't actually raise your hand, but push the button at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand. To be recognized. And while you're not speaking, please mute your line so we avoid any unnecessary noise in the background. So I'm going to ask the group to go around, and Ms. McKee, I'm going to ask to start with you.
Thank you very much, Marion McKee, School Board.
Denise Brooks, School Board.
Mike Thorwart, School Board.
Ed Salomon, School Board.
Ed Tate, School Board.
It looks like Mr. Hidalgo is in the process of joining us.
Okay. And we also have Dr. Frazier with us, our superintendent.
Good evening, everyone.
Mr. Stone, our business manager.
Good evening.
And Kevin, can you introduce yourself, please?
As Kevin Karpuk with Cornerstone Advisors Asset Management.
Wonderful. And Ms. Marcel will not be joining us tonight. She has a conflict. Mr. Block is running late, and Mr. Hidalgo is logging on, and we'll recognize him as soon as he becomes live. Have we captured everyone?
Yes, I believe so.
And I am Mark Bialik, School Board member. Bill, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bialik. Good evening, everyone. Tonight's Finance Committee meeting has a healthy agenda. We do have a number of action items that we'll be asking to move forward to the June 3rd board meeting. And the reason that you're seeing so many agenda items is due to that change in the meeting date. Normally our June meeting would occur after Finance Committee meeting, but with the change this year, the June Finance Committee will actually be after the June board meeting. So we have a number of annual motions that we must move forward tonight in order to get onto the June agenda. And the main part of our discussion will focus on the final budget, which is set to be adopted at that June 3rd meeting. But without any further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Karpuk, who is here to give his quarterly update on the district's investments. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me tonight. If you want to go to the next page, what you're seeing here is the Treasury yield curve that we normally take a look at. That top line, the line that's almost always the highest, was where bond yields were back at the end of 2019. The dark blue line is where bond yields were at the beginning of this year, and then the lighter blue line is where they were at the end of the first quarter. And I would point out that the reopening trade, as the economy has reopened, has pushed longer term bond yields up since the beginning of the year, and certainly recovered back to pre-pandemic levels. But when you look back on towards the left side of this graph, you notice that those two blue lines are pretty much stuck together at a very low level. That's really influenced by the Federal Reserve and their policies. And if we jump 2 slides ahead, one of the things that, especially in the cash management program, we are to some extent reliant on the Federal Reserve to move rates off of zero. And what we're looking at here, and we've looked at before, is the Fed's dot plot. So each of those yellow circles indicate one of the voting members of the Federal Open Market Committee, where they think interest rates are going to be at the end of 2021, at the end of 2022, and the end of 2023, and then further out. You see that line is flat. The Fed, maybe at the end of 2023, there are a couple members who think the Fed might be able to raise rates, but up until that point, that is just a flat line. And the Fed's been fairly vocal about saying that they have no intention to raise rates anytime soon. But the interesting takeaway from this chart is that white line, and it's a little bit hard to see, but that is the market. It's actually folks trading money based on where they think future interest rates are going to be. And what you notice is there is some upward momentum. The market is not believing the Fed will be able to keep interest rates at basically zero for the indefinite future. And, you know, and it isn't a huge jump up, but it certainly gives us some breathing room in terms of driving income in the portfolio. And the reason this is interesting is for the past decade, that role was reversed, where the Federal Reserve would always have these dots higher and the market just had them really low. The market was saying, come on, Fed, you're not going to be able to raise rates the way you think you will be able to. And the market was right. You know, the Fed just kept coming back down. So that could possibly signal a little bit of good news that the market does have higher hopes for the Fed moving rates up. And, you know, the downside to that, when we step back and not just look at this cash investment vehicle, part of the reason the market's pretty, or is indicating that rates will have to move up quicker, is the fact that there has been some whiff of inflation, whether it's labor or materials. You know, certainly in the short term, prices of many assets have gone up. So, you know, for this particular portion of the district's balance sheet and income statement, that, you know, some inflation is good news, but obviously there are knock-on effects at other areas when you take a step back and look at the district's overall needs and investments. So if we move 2 pages, or I'm sorry, yeah, that page, sorry. I had mentioned that rates are incredibly low, and we do have 4 current partner organizations approved by the board, and you'll see that, you know, Pliget is at 0.01% on their standard product. If you go to the plus, I believe it's 0.02%. So you would get double your return of basically nothing. Stonecastle is at 8 basis points, so 0.08%. TD has actually been playing ball well and maintaining a 0.25% rate. And we've had, and by we I mean Mr. Stone and Cornerstone have had conversations with TD about that and making sure everything's aligned and you know, and trying to get as much assurance as possible that that rate won't be coming down any further. And then Wilmington Trust, where we own the individual bonds, is about 0.13. I would note that after the end of the quarter in April 14th, I believe may have been the date, the district did move $50 million from Pliget to TD Bank to try to drive some return. Again, we're not talking, you know, we're not talking retirement type, you know, returns or stock market type returns, but it's a significant delta when you look at all things considered. So, you know, that was done, and that'll be reflected on next quarter's cash flow sheet. And I'm going to jump ahead, Bill. I don't know that this page is going to be very legible, but this has all of the different pools and all of the cash flows, income, expenses, withdrawals for the quarter, but we haven't figured out how to make it more legible with as many numbers. But I think the next page, you know, can help inform what we've been doing. And again, we break out the different pools at the bottom. So you see Pliget is the green box, the letter C. Wilmington Trust is the orange triangle, letter F. But then at the top, we put them on top of what's called a peer group. So that gray box, and these are different time periods. So last quarter, year to date, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, that gray box is all of the other money market funds out in the world. And these money markets can do a lot more than we can under Act 10. You know, they can do some riskier commercial paper, they can do some different things, but what you'll notice by and large, other than First National Bank of Newtown, is all of these options we've chosen and have money invested in and moved around with have been at the very top of the peer group. So, the last quarter, everything's kind of jumbled, but look out at the last 2 year, 3 year, 4 years, you see Wilmington Trust has been in the top 1%. So they've beaten 99% of the other folks trying to manage money like this. And then you look down, you see TD is in, I believe that's the second percentile. The aggregate portfolio is in the second percentile over 2 years. So, while the numbers aren't staggering, they're certainly above and beyond, what we would have gotten if we just tucked it into a money market and walked away. So, we're pleased with that performance. And when we look at the underlying portfolios, and we won't spend too much time on it, but if you move one page ahead, we do have transparency into the holdings, and we're comfortable with them. You see here is the Wilmington Trust portfolio, where they do have a good range of different coupons. So they're not huge, but they do have diversification. They have diversification across time, where they did lock in some bonds that mature in 2023, but all well within the policy. And then if you jump ahead to Pliget, again, we brought the Pliget allocation down significantly since the end of the quarter, but we did get the updated holdings of the portfolio, and everything is in line with expectation and works, based on our policies, the district's policy that is, and our expectations. But I would remind everybody that when we were at these levels of rates last time, there was a lag with Pliget catching up, as there were some fee recapture things that happened. So we'll just be keeping a very close eye on that. And before I ask if they're in TD, we maintain the Federal Home Loan Bank letter of credit. But before I ask if there are any questions, I did just want to take an opportunity. I know that Bill is moving on, and just wanted to thank him for all of the good work over the past couple of years. He had big shoes to fill when Bob retired, and whoever the board finds will have big shoes to fill again. And just wanted to thank him, and we appreciated the partnership while it lasted. So with that, I will ask if there are any questions.
I don't see any hands raised by the board. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Seeing none there, Kevin, I'll just say, you've done a great job. While we're talking about small percentage points, 0.25%, 0.08%, whatever that was, there's a couple real benefits here. First of all, prior to Kevin coming on board, just for the public, 100% of our money was in Pliget, and that's the one that had 0.01%. Not only that, we did not have the transparency. We had concerns about safety because of the levels of insurance. So even in this difficult market, the C.225 from TD Bank is really great and surprising. But even in this difficult market, Kevin and the work from Cornerstone has brought us more income to the district than certainly the average out there, the average school district. We've increased our transparency, we've increased our income, and we've increased the safety for our deposits, and can't do any better than that. Kevin, has anyone else come on board here? Is anybody else doing this other than Council Rock?
We haven't had much success in the school district space. There are some other municipalities we work with. What you'll see in this board has, I'm being recorded, so I have to be careful how I say it, like the foresight to appreciate the process and the policies. A lot of other people are looking at it and saying, you know, if I can get 0.1% somewhere without worrying about the collateral, you know, that's all I'm going to get. And so, you know, we do think as when rates normalized, we captured a couple other pieces of municipal business, but now that they've fallen back down, a lot of people seem like they're just throwing up their hands rather than planning as this board did, you know, when we were retained, when rates were basically where they are now. So, but I appreciate your kind words, and our team works hard to try to get as much as possible, as safely as possible for the district.
Yeah, great work. Well, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Okay, Bill. Next,
Kevin, thank you for the nice sentiments. It's been my pleasure. Your pleasure to work with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bill, the next agenda item. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bialik. So this is the first of several annual motions that we take up at this time to prepare for the upcoming fiscal year. And related to what Mr. Karpuk just discussed, this is the approval of the depositories for the upcoming year. And you'll notice that there's no recommended changes for the upcoming year. We're satisfied with the services that we're receiving. We certainly would like to see higher rates, but that is not necessarily a function of the institutions themselves, but rather the market. So we would ask that this be moved to the consent agenda for the June 3rd board meeting. Are there any questions?
I'm not seeing any raised hands. Bill, let me just make a comment before we go on to the next slide or the next item. I should have said this at the outset, and we're on Zoom tonight, so this isn't live on YouTube. You can watch it later on YouTube, but there was discussion among the board members some time ago about moving committee meetings to Zoom, and I, for one, am embracing that for convenience of the public, but especially with finance, because we're going to get into charts and numbers. We saw that a bit with Kevin. And it's just so much easier to see it with Zoom than trying to capture it on the screen from what we're projecting in the boardroom. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility on that. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Bill. You can move on.
Okay, thank you. The next item is to approve the purchasing cooperatives that we will be permitted to use in 21-22. And we appreciate that the board 2 years ago granted us the opportunity to provide for more efficient and bid protected purchasing options. Much of what is in the school code is, as far as purchasing goes, is antiquated and doesn't reflect the real world environment in which we operate, Amazon.com, et cetera. So these purchasing cooperatives give us the opportunity to utilize a more efficient way to purchase goods and services, but to do so in a appropriately competitive environment. So we are able to a little more carefully select vendors and still have them compete for our business through what we call mini bids, and it allows us to streamline these processes. We are recommending the addition of 2 new cooperatives in the upcoming year, Buy Board and Sourcewell. We annually review each of the recommended cooperatives to ensure that that they have an appropriate product list that we can buy from, and we entertain any new cooperatives where we think we might be able to further expand our use of this option. And Buy Board and Sourcewell have been vetted by the solicitor, and we believe that they would be appropriate to add to our list for next year. Are there any questions?
Not seeing anything. Oh, we have one question. Let's see. Mr. Tate.
Thank you, Mr. Bialik. I just wanted to note for the sake of the public that the district has had great success in the past with these purchasing cooperatives, particularly I think in the area of healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So expanding this effort is a great idea. Thank you, Mr. Stone.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Tate. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, Bill. You can move on.
Very good.
I'm sorry, Mr. Solomon has his hand raised.
Yeah, just a real quick comment and question to Bill. Bill, 2 years ago when you presented this, I thought it was smart and cut out a lot of red tape, so to speak, and delivered a product. And we saw savings. Any sense 2 years later, how much easier, give the perspective of 2 years into this, how much easier this has made Matt's life, your life, our cabinet's life when it comes to making these purchasing items?
Yeah, I can speak for the business office. This cuts out a significant amount of red tape and gives us the ability to relieve burden off of the departments that might have to go through a lot of gymnastics to get something purchased that they need quickly. So it's a very good option, and it meets with a high standard of using taxpayer funds. So it's been a good way for my office to get back some time to be able to focus on some more strategic purchasing initiatives. So it has worked well.
Good. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Solomon.
Okay, the next item, this is also an annual motion. This is a recommendation to renew for another year our food service management company contract with Chartwells. So Chartwells has performed very well, been a very steady hand during the pandemic. I believe the board and the community are well aware of the challenges that came about with providing the free food to all our families. We had underwhelming response initially, and then a significant uptick, and Chartwells has been a very good partner throughout the process. We are eligible to renew the contract for 3 more years after this renewal. We will be required to go out for an RFP in 2024, and that is a state rule. But our recommendation is to renew this contract in the hopes that we will return to a more normal type of environment sometime in the near future, and we hope to do so with Chartwells at our side. Any questions?
Mr. Solomon has his hand raised.
Now, just a comment, Mark, and Bill, 2 years ago, I questioned Chartwells and basically questioning some of, how they delivered their product and what we saw. I got honestly say in 2 years, they've turned this around for us. They've been a partner that I've been hoping they've become. And this last year, to your point, they've been extraordinary with getting food out for the kids to have a meal, whether they're virtual or in school. And please send my compliments back to our point people at Chartwells. Again, I questioned it 2 years ago, and 2 years later, humble pie is I'm not afraid to eat it. It's good. I'm glad that we've leveled out and we've developed a good partner that's going to last us many years. So please extend my thank yous and appreciation for what they've done, not only this school year, but in forming a relationship that I think has paid dividends to Council Rock.
I shall. Thank you.
Well said, Mr. Solomon. They've been a great partner, and it really was. They shined during the pandemic. It was great to see us be able to feed the community the way we did. Well said, Ed. Okay, moving on.
All right, very good. Thank you. The next consent agenda item is to establish the categories of committed fund balance for the upcoming year. So this is a requirement of United States generally accepted accounting principles to establish the areas in which we could commit funds in both the general fund and capital reserve funds. The board is not establishing any amounts at this time. Those amounts are established and communicated after the financial audit is completed, which I anticipate will be finalized sometime in October or November, and will be communicated at that time. We are not recommending any changes to the committed categories in the general fund for this year, and that does include the COVID-19 expenditures classification. It would be my recommendation to maintain that category in the hope that the pandemic is fully completed and we can have a much better handle on whether there will be any unexpected or unanticipated major COVID expenses. We've certainly got through the hurdle of PPE. We anticipate some minor increases in or some minor spending in next year's budget to refresh some of that PPE. But we do think that we are mostly, knock wood, done with the spending out of that fund. However, I do think it's prudent to maintain that for at least another year. Within the capital reserve fund, this is a similar recommendation, no changes to the three categories that we have: capital projects or CIP, the technology category, as well as transportation. So there is already some money in the transportation line item, about $450,000, which was from a retroactive reimbursement of alternative fuel credit money from the federal government. And as we discussed the final budget, one of the significant commitments that we would like to make as part of that budget is the transfer of additional funds into the capital reserve fund in the amount recommended of $3 million to go towards summer projects, but also $500,000 to go into the technology category, which would, if approved, be utilized and could accumulate over multiple years to fund major infrastructure projects, device purchases as we refresh one-to-one, and help smooth out the general operating budget through that commitment. So again, just a reminder, this is the categories only, no amounts. Those amounts will be established after the audit. Any questions about either of those two slides?
I am not seeing any hands. No one has questions about this?
I'm sorry, I can't raise my hand right now. Joe Hidalgo. Bill,
Yes.
or actually Mr. Matthew Fredrickson. I know last year we were holding off on old servers, 10-year-old server hard drives or backup hardware. Is this $500,000 going to help upgrade those systems?
To answer your question, Mr. Hidalgo, I actually have in the budget for this year, actually take place this summer to upgrade those systems. This $500,000 will actually start seeding, as Mr. Stone just mentioned, a technology fund, so that as each year as projects come up, I'll have a fund to go through and won't necessarily have to. If we look comparatively at my budget over the years, this year I have a significant uptick in terms of my budget. And the reason for that is some of these projects that need to be done this summer, we don't really have an option at this point. The $500,000 fund that Mr. Stone's trying to create for technology will help even that out over the years. As each year we'll put that amount of money into it as the budget allows. And then as we need to refresh Chromebooks, as we need to refresh desktops and servers and other infrastructure equipment, we'll be able to use part of those funds to help offset the cost. So it creates a more of an even keel going in the long run. But to answer your question directly, no, this isn't going to be used for that, because I have that in my operations budget for the 2021-2022 school year.
Okay, well, that's great. I've been 100% favor of this, and I give Bill Stone a lot of credit for focusing on the technology. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. All right, anyone else before we move on? Okay, Bill, thank you.
Thank you. The next recommendation is to approve the establishment of a debt service fund. And the rationale behind this recommendation comes from the recent decision to approve and move forward with the Sulfine-Stone project, which necessitates an increase in the 2022 and 23, let me make sure I say this, 22-23 and 23-24 operating budgets. There will be one-time increases in the debt service budget. So a debt service fund functions much like our medical internal service fund, where the general fund makes contributions to a separate fund, an accounting fund, where those funds are held and then utilized to pay for our debt service payments. So this, we will be able to transfer those funds needed in future years into this debt service fund, and they will be held securely until those one-time increases come along. So this is a preferred option to what we just discussed regarding the commitment of fund balance, because this, once it goes into a debt service fund, it's protected and reserved simply for the payment of principal and interest on debt service. So there are two benefits associated with a debt service fund. Obviously, we can set aside that $2.4 million that's needed for the Soul Finestone project in 22-23 and 23-24. But there's also, over the long term, an opportunity to build debt capacity through bond refinancings, which right now simply go back into unassigned fund balance when they happen. We can't take advantage of those savings in future years. If we're prudent with our budgeting and ensure that we continue to commit at least the amount of money towards debt service each and every year, and then any non-recurring transfers. So in the event that there's a future year surplus or a transfer from other funds, that those can go into the debt service fund and help offset future increases in the debt payments without necessarily having to dramatically increase the general fund operating budget. But if we focus on just the short term for this discussion, because we just want to deal with the here and now at this point and recognize that there are these long-term benefits. The current state that we're operating in, there's really no change in terms of the dollar amount of the budget that's necessary. It's just really where the funds are paid from. So in the current model, funds are paid directly out of the general fund for principal and interest. That's what P&I is right here, principal and interest. In the current model, they are an expenditure, and that's what's noted here. In the proposed model, those principal and interest payments are transferred from the general fund and then physically paid from the debt service fund. So the general fund still shows an $18.8 million negative on the expense side, but instead of it being an expenditure, it's now a transfer into the debt service fund. We talked about refinancing savings and the ability for those to accumulate in the debt service fund rather than in unassigned fund balance. And then the commitment amount for the Soul Finestone project at $2.4 million roughly is not needed for another 2 fiscal years, fiscal years 2 and 3 away. So we can lock those funds away and they'll be available for the increases at that time. So a recommendation that we would put on the board agenda for June 3rd would be twofold: to approve the establishment of the debt service fund, and then also approve a one-time transfer of $2.4 million from the general fund, which ostensibly comes from the operating surplus that we've discussed over the last couple of meetings. We would take that money now out of the general fund and move it over to the debt service fund as the startup money for that, and it would wait until it's needed in 2 years to be funded. So are there any questions about the debt service fund recommendation?
Not seeing any questions or comments. I'll just note that Mr. Black has joined the meeting. Joe, since you can't raise your hand, do you have any questions or comments? I'm going to assume that's a no. I'll comment. Bill, I think this is extremely smart. I think it's very valuable to segment funds like this and to put that aside to address our debt issues, which are ever increasing. So I appreciate you bringing this to the board. I hope everybody supports it. It's a very, very smart move, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on.
Very good. The next item is a recommendation to upgrade our ERP system, our Enterprise Resource Planning System, or more commonly our financial software. We currently utilize a system from Tyler Technologies. It's called Munis, and it's version 11.3. It was implemented in the 2008-2009 fiscal year. So we are now, because of that implementation, we are now facing a support expiration date of October 1st of 2022. And that's a critical date for us because after that point, if we were to have an issue when generating the calendar 2022 W-2s, we would not have any support from the software provider if there were to be an issue. And on occasion, there are issues with any software and internet outages that fouls up the file and things of that nature. And we simply cannot take the risk of having our ERP system not be supported. Although we like to think of ourselves as a community and a small community at that, we are not a small organization. 1,300 employees, $246 million budget, and it is every day we need that system in order just to operate. So it is critical that we do something with the ERP system. So as I mentioned, the current configuration is version 11.3, and we are operating what's known as on-premise hosting. So Council Rock School District is responsible for all of the hardware, all of the storage, the security, and all of the updates to the system at a tune of about $100,000 per year in annual licensing fees. So you'll also see that with being responsible for hardware and storage, we occasionally have a required investment in server space and storage space so that we can maintain all of our backups. And obviously that security is the responsibility of Council Rock personnel, and updates to the software are the responsibility of Council Rock personnel. We do recommend converting to their current version, which is 2020.3, but to move into a software as a service model, or perhaps more commonly known as a cloud-based model. Although it is slightly more expensive by about $50,000, Tyler Technologies becomes responsible for those very significant responsibilities, and in the benefits to the school district that are quantifiable are this avoided $100,000 hardware investment. But what cannot be quantified is the better security that we will see from the software as a service arrangement. The responsibility is with a company that is far more experienced at handling clients larger than us, and we're not relying on, we're less reliant on the human beings in our district to make these critical updates. So this is obviously our recommendation to move to that model and try to make sure that what is becoming even more critical data is appropriately stored and appropriately secured. Are there any questions?
Looks like Dr. Thorward has a question.
Yes, please. Bill, excuse me. Since we're jumping to software as a service, we're putting this basically in the cloud. Excuse me, there's two issues in my mind. One is security. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. Give me a second. And the other is, have we considered, why are we staying with Tyler? I mean, is there a reason for staying with Tyler? Aside from because that's what we've always done, it's convenient. Have we looked out further? And
we had some conversations to that end, and we just did not feel that we were prepared for the process of moving from Tyler to something new and providing all the training and implementation that would be necessary. We just did not feel that the organization would be able to handle such a conversion on the tight timeline that you noted, because this conversion, although October 1st of 2022 feels like a long time away, the work needs to begin very, very soon in order to get this in place. So that was the collective thinking on that front.
I would just suggest, and it's just a suggestion, that once this is in the cloud, two things happen. One is we no longer control it. I mean, we say we own the data, but we don't. As soon as you put it in the cloud, it's somebody else's. And two, it gets harder to get it back if we want to change systems later. So I hear you, inertia is a big deal, and it's hard to get around. But my concern with this is we just became a captive audience for a long time. And it's just something to consider. I'm not trying to get in the way of your proposal here, and this is your recommendation, but it's something to consider longer term.
Dr.
That's all.
Thorne, Dr. Thorne, if I could respond to that, those were definitely concerns that I had about moving to the cloud model. One of the advantages from a security standpoint is that we no longer have to worry about access in terms of the data center, the network, et cetera, et cetera. They take full responsibility for that. The only security that we're responsible for is who we give access to in terms of the credentials to logging in the system. And that would be a concern of ours, whether it was on-prem or in the cloud. What it does do is in the event that our network would be compromised, and I'm doing everything I can to prevent that, but if it was, the advantage of it being in the cloud is they would not have access to any of that data. So from a security standpoint, they have far more resources to leverage in terms of security and securing the data than we do here in-house. Secondly, as far as accessing the data, we have full access to the data at any time that we need it. It is still being housed in terms of a Microsoft SQL environment, so we can do backups if we want to. We can copy the data down. We have full access to that. We do not lose that. And once again, it does require us to go through a couple of hoops from a security standpoint, but I'm very comfortable with that. And I do agree, it would be advantageous for us to look for another system. But as Mr. Stone said, just looking at the bandwidth that is required and the resources we have right now, I just don't know that it's possible.
And I'm not suggesting that we need to do it this year, but it's something to consider long term. That's all.
Very good. Good questions. I don't see any other hands. Anyone else? Okay, very good. Moving on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bialik. This next item is really a housekeeping item that we came across as we were going through the process of approving tax collectors compensation, which was done back in February. In 2012, the state passed a law allowing school districts to offer installment payment options to all taxpayers. And the school district at that time took advantage of that by adopting a resolution outlining the rules of how that installment payment would work. You'll note in the picture at the bottom here that original 2012 resolution included an opportunity for taxpayers who missed the first installment payment deadline of August 31st to, as long as they made their next payment at the penalty amount, they could continue to pay in installments, which was a more generous requirement than what was set forth in the statute. The statute simply states that if you miss that first deadline, you've indicated that you are not interested in paying in installments. So what we discovered is that we, despite that practice being in the resolution back in 2012, the district and the tax collectors never followed that resolution in practice. We simply used August 31st as the deadline. And so what my recommendation is to update this 2012 resolution with a more current version and have that resolution approved so that the resolution reflects the current practice that we have here in the district, and it should not have any impact on our taxpaying community, as folks have not had the opportunity to take advantage of this in the past. So I'll take any questions that folks might have at this time.
I don't see any questions. Bill, I want to ask though, so the board passed a resolution that said, that allowed, trying to think how I can phrase this, that allowed for these installments to be paid after August 31st, but the tax collectors and the district administration decided not to follow that. Is that what we're saying? And then reverting back to what the actual statute was?
Yes, that's what I presume happened. I can't, I cannot speak to whether we, for a year or two, followed this practice or if there was some change midstream. I don't know all of the history on that. The tax collectors don't think that there was ever a time where we allowed folks to follow the more generous resolution. It was simply follow the statute.
Well, I have no problem correcting the issue now, so that we have August 31st, but I'm always concerned about our administration not following the direction of the board. So that's troubling to me, but I'll not stand in the way of correcting this issue. I would just like to see if any taxpayers were harmed during that period of time from 2012 until now, with penalties or something like that. Maybe we owe a refund to somebody.
That would be a difficult endeavor to undertake, to try to find out who may have been harmed. It would require research such as, trying to find who may have called to request paying after August 31st. And so I just fear that good documentation doesn't exist, and it would need to come from tax collectors, some of whom are now unfortunately deceased. And I think it would be virtually impossible to gather that. But your point is well taken. It was why we needed to make this correction, so that we weren't out of compliance with a board resolution.
Yeah, and I don't know, Mr. Cox isn't here, and I'm just wondering what weight a board resolution has, on actions of the district, if it's the same as a policy. But I'd like to ask our administration what other policies maybe we need to look at that maybe aren't being followed, because this concerns me. Okay. We'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bialik. The next item for consideration would be a discussion item on the June 3rd board agenda. It would be a revisit to the PSERS funding reform and accountability resolution that we had discussed at that committee meeting. I have drafted a resolution for the board's consideration, one that is supported by the district's financial advisory committee, that seeks to address the key points that are noted on the slide here. That there is, as we'll see when we do the budget presentation, there's a need for immediate funding reform for local school districts to relieve the burden of 35% contributions gross. Obviously, there's a 50% contribution from the state, but that number continues to grow, and also to address some of the transparency that seems to be lacking with respect to some of the probes that the PSERS organization is currently under right now through grand jury investigation and an FBI probe, and those relate generally to investment managers' performance, and also some of the internal controls that they have around spending and conflicts of interest. So I would like to take an opportunity to work on some updated draft language, as this is an evolving issue. These are active probes right now. So we just want to make sure that we are, if we are to approve a resolution, that it is factually accurate and timely to the circumstances. So what I can do for the board is update it with the most up-to-date information and share it with you prior to that June 3rd meeting, so that you can have some opportunity to review it. And then we would have this as a discussion item prior to approval at the meeting on the 3rd. Are there any questions?
I'm not seeing anything.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have two items that that will be forthcoming recommendations on June 3rd, and just sort of reflect the accelerated timeline that we're dealing with this committee meeting, which is understandable. But this is typically the time we seek our insurance renewals. We always go to market with the assistance of our broker, and we have quotes for our package of insurance, which includes our property and casualty liability insurances, cyber liability, student accident, things of that nature, and workers' compensation. We want to review those quotes thoughtfully, determine if there's any possible coverage changes or changes to deductibles or coverage limits that might best match our risk profile. So we'll be making a recommendation to the board. This will be a discussion item on the June 3rd agenda. And the second item on this slide is a recommendation to approve a transportation bid consultant. The first student contract expires on July 31st of 2022, which is the conclusion of next school year. And this is a complicated RFP process, and there's more than $10 million at stake with the results of this RFP. So we want to engage a consultant who would be able to assist us with not only the blocking and tackling associated with the bid process, preparing the RFP, evaluating the results, developing a rubric for us, ensuring a competitive bidding environment, making sure that we receive as many bids as possible to ensure good competition, but also to develop a strategy around the operation of the school district so that we are able to put together a package that reflects the reality of what it is to transport 150, use 150 school buses and deal with a propane fleet that we have, which is growing in numbers, but not as many school districts have that type of fleet. But with having two bus depots, there's opportunity to be strategic in how we put out an RFP. That work will need to begin soon in order to have an RFP. I use the terms bid and RFP interchangeably. I should be more specific. This would be an RFP, a request for proposal of services. And we want to have somebody on board as soon as we can so that we are able to get a bid prepared and put it out in the fall. There needs to be a lot of time if there were to be a change to onboard a new contractor, make sure that things are lined up so that there is no disruption to service come the start of the 22-23 school year. We have received proposals from 2 firms, but again, in the spirit of being thoughtful in our review, I would request, and I just inform you that we'll have a recommendation for you as a discussion item for June 3rd. I view this as an investment that certainly there is a cost associated with utilizing another set of eyes, but that the potential benefits that would result from the strategy and the competitive bidding environment could yield significant savings over the life of a new contract. Are there any questions on either of those 2 items?
Ms. McKee has her hand raised. Ms. McKee?
Thanks very much. I certainly don't challenge your recommendation in any way, but I'm just curious, as I've never heard of a transportation bid consultant before. If you could, Mr. Stone, just fill me in a little bit more. Have we ever used one in Council Rock? Have surrounding districts used this service? Thank you.
Ms. McKee, I don't know if Council Rock School District has ever used a consultant, not to my knowledge. I am aware that Central Bucks School District, whose contract with First Student expired or expires at the end of this school year, did utilize one of the 2 firms that is proposing on our work. So it did help with their process to make sure that they were able to put together the RFP and get it out in a timely manner, particularly for their case during the midst of a pandemic with a lot of other challenges going on. So I think we're not the leader on this one, but certainly there's some precedent just to the west. You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. McKee. Anyone else? I also,
I'm sorry.
sorry, go ahead, Joe.
I can't raise my hand. I apologize. Is there other areas, Mr. Stoner, you believe that maybe in other bidding areas where a consultant might come in handy or in the future?
If I may, Mr.
Like
Hidalgo,
state
I'd like to
construction.
give that some consideration. This one in particular is right in front of me, so it's top of mind. But if I may, I'd like to take some time to give that some thought. I certainly subscribe to the notion that if you are able to find another set of eyes to to improve the process, to improve the result, that's always a good thing. It's very important to be mindful of the costs associated with that, and also to make sure that there are defined service expectations, what we want and what we expect from said consultant, if that would be used. So I think as a general statement, that's where I stand on the use of a consultant.
I appreciate that, because I mean, we're at the tail end of a long string of construction bids, and I just feel like an extra set of eyes moving forward could be helpful and cost effective if we can find savings. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Mr. Block?
Yeah, I just wanted to applaud Mr. Stone on the recommendation. I do look forward to seeing kind of the cost benefit analysis. This particular bid in transportation has been one of the more difficult for us to create good outcomes. So if these folks can bring more folks to the table and get us better outcomes, I certainly look forward to considering that. And again, hats off to bringing a different approach to this. And I do appreciate Mr. Hidalgo's comment as well about the same type of approach to other contracts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Thorwart?
Yes, I'm gonna just I wasn't gonna say anything, but I'll segue into what Mr. Hidalgo said as well. We've got a lot of professional service contracts out there, and frankly, some of them, as evidenced by lots of the meetings lately, have gotten too comfortable with us. So I'm with Joe. I'd like to see all of our professional services looked at again. Go out to bids, probably the wrong word, but get proposals and maybe rattle the trees a little bit and see what else we can find. Thanks.
I think the RFP process is very important. You all have been hearing me say this for close to 8 years now, and we've been successful in getting some of them done and not successful in others. So I think it's very important. And I think this is smart. I agree with Mr. Block. It's smart, Bill, to have this outside consultant being considered, especially in light of the fact that we're losing you at the end of the month, the end of June. So we don't really have that. We're gonna have a new person coming in, and I'm sure that a consultant in this process, this very important process, because this is a challenging RFP, this transportation RFP. So I think it's going to bring a lot to the district. So well done.
All right, very good. If I may, I'll move on to the probably the most important topic of the evening, the 21-22 final budget. I notice I did not update that number there. Forgive me for that error. So this is the traditional way we begin the discussion of the next year's budget, is by focusing on how we anticipate finishing the current year. We call it either current year emerging or current year estimate. This discussion has been had a little bit already in the last couple of weeks. So I just wanted to start by kind of giving a little bit more flavor to how these numbers come about when you look at a comparison of actual versus budget. First thing I want to say is that there's been some phrasing used that I just want to make sure folks understand that this is not found money. We don't find money in the school district under my watch. That's just not how it happens. What happens is we make assumptions and projections for the budget with the best information that we have available at the time. And what we had available at the time of the adoption of the 2021 budget was a 6-week-old pandemic with pretty dire projections for the future. We were still not allowed to leave our houses, and there were some pretty bleak economic pictures being painted. And so prudence was necessary at that time, and so we made some significant adjustments to the revenue that we had in the budget, and and made some reductions in expenditures that that at the time we needed to do to bring the budget into balance. And you may recall that at the time we had a $3 million budget deficit that was that I was very concerned about at that time, because without knowing whether our revenue projections were too high or too low, that $3 million could have very easily flipped and created a more substantial issue for us. Now, fortunately, the projections for the overall economic impact of the pandemic did not hit the Council Rock School District as hard as it has some other communities that are more tourism centered, more service industry centered. So our revenues did not dip to the extent that we anticipated. But for context, this $8.5 million surplus that we anticipate seeing is the equivalent on our budget of if you were expecting to spend $100 on something, this is the equivalent of coming in and spending $97.60 instead. So we are not, when you think about our scale, I don't want to minimize the impact of $8.5 million because it is a lot of money in its purest sense. But on an organization of our size, a 2% increase or decrease on either side of the budget really does not translate into what I would call a significant amount of money. So again, we anticipate in the current for the current year, which is this middle column, that our revenues will exceed our projections, mostly in local revenue, but to some extent state revenue. The big hitters in here are a $2.3 million increase from estimate to budget in earned income taxes, a $1.8 million increase in real estate transfer taxes, a $1.1 million increase in real estate taxes, which that is in part due to continued conservatism in how we had budgeted for real estate taxes prior to the pandemic, but also we are seeing some significant current collections from Portnoy, the new delinquent real estate tax collector, and that number is reflected in current real estate taxes. On the expenditure side of the budget, you see that we came in just short of $6 million under budget, again, 2.4% under budget. The big driver of that was the fact that for the better part of 15% of this year, we did not need to provide transportation services, and therefore there's savings when we don't need those services. We don't pay for those services. There were also savings due to changes in salaries where folks who were on leave, those leaves can either save us money or cost us money depending on the length of those leaves and the individual who takes that leave. But we did save about $1.7 million from that in both the professional and support staff units. And with that comes the savings in fringe benefits such as Social Security and PSERS. And then there were many other smaller savings in all the other accounts throughout the budget due to, just the general prudence that we applied to the budget. We metered out spending so that 70% of the budget was available for the first 6 months of the year. Again, just trying to be prepared for the worst case scenario with the pandemic. And then after that 6-month period, we metered out another 25% of the budget and asked folks to reserve 5% of their individual budgets. So you see those savings in areas like per diem substitutes, repairs and maintenance expenses, supplies, and equipment. So when you apply that $8.5 million increase to which our surplus, which ends up going into fund balance, you can see where we estimate the fund balance will be. So this is our actual ending fund balance as of the end of last fiscal year, totaling just shy of $23 million. And what we do to calculate the estimated ending fund balance for this fiscal year is we start with the debt service fund transfer, which in this analysis I presumed would be approved by the board. So we take that $2.4 million out of fund balance and set it aside in the debt service fund. And then we start with the budget balancing, which we'll discuss in much more detail when we get into the details of the budget at $1.25 million. And then our policy calls for retaining 5% fund balance in what we call the unassigned category. So that's simply taking 5% times the next year's expenditure number. And then that leaves the amount of money available for restrictions and commitments. But again, those numbers don't get determined until the end of the audit process into which categories they will go. This will bring ending fund balance, again, estimated with a few months still left in the fiscal year, to $29.1 million, which represents a total of 11.6% of the overall budget. I did ask for PFM to take a look at that, what appears to be a fairly significant increase in 1 year over in our fund balance. And they were kind enough to share with me the methodology that Standard & Poor's, the rating agency, uses for determining when you can move into the next category. Now, this is not definitive guidance. They factor in quantitative as well as qualitative factors. So there's no guarantees of an increase in a bond rating, but PFM has stated that this is a very good step in the direction of a bond rating upgrade, but that we are still short in fund balance of the next tier in S&P's rating category. They look for folks to have a greater than 15% fund balance in their line item in order to move them up into the next category, which would translate into $37.5 million. Which again, that would not necessarily automatically determine an increase, but would certainly put us in a better position to have a rating upgrade. I'm going to take just a quick pause there and ask for any questions on the 2021 estimated operations before we move into the 21-22 budget recommendation.
Mr. Black.
Thanks, Bill. That was great. Just quick question for clarity. So when I was looking a few slides back, we had planned to spend $3 million. We finished favorable $8 million. So relative to plan, it's really more $11.5 million favorable.
Yes, that's correct. You would add plus 5.5 million of revenue and minus 6 million of expenditures.
And I appreciate you clarifying that while these numbers are big, on a percentage basis, it's pretty consistent, I think, with what we've kind of seen in the past, and just represents good discipline on the team's behalf. I have a question for you on the last statement that you just made. One of the things that we'd talked about in the past was level of fund balance. How much is too high relative to either taxes or starting to make investments in education, and those trade-offs. But what we never talked about in the past when having those conversations was the credit rating. So I guess, my question for you would be to educate us around, going to a $37 million fund balance. It's different today than it was, maybe 8 years ago when we were running higher fund balances, but it's still a really big number. And there are, I would imagine, benefits to interest rates or debt service or financing associated with that AAA. Maybe talk a little bit about how you would view those things, the optics of a really big fund balance and not doing anything with it, or what we might do with taxes, as opposed to, hey, here's a really big benefit a AAA credit rating gives you that would make you want to consider pushing for that fund balance. Thank you.
Sure. So I would say that a bond rating upgrade saves the district money over the 25 years that those monies are borrowed. And I don't want to quote the number because I don't have it handy, but I have had PFM do that analysis of what a rating upgrade would translate into. I've also had them do rating downgrade analyses, and would like to follow up with what that number is, but there's fairly substantial savings per $10 million of money borrowed. And at a time where there are significant funds to be borrowed in the next several years, we obviously have to be mindful of that credit rating. I understand the realities around, how much is too much, because again, pure dollars, $29.1 million is a significant amount of money to, to do nothing with, to use that term. I don't control how the rating agencies view the district. I try to make recommendations that have a long-term benefit, and a rating upgrade certainly would help save money over the long term of upcoming debt borrowings.
Okay.
So I will follow up with some more specifics on the actual quantifying of a rating upgrade, if that would be okay.
Yeah, no, that'd be perfect. You just get concerned as, taxpayers see us holding that money there. If there's a value to the district that drives, taxes lower than they would have been to doing that, I think that's just something we have to demonstrate. And if that's not the right decision, then it's good that we looked at it. Look forward to seeing that.
Dr. Thorwart.
Thank you. I'm looking at these two numbers on the screen and seeing the $6 million delta. And I know perhaps I'm the only one that has to, or looks in the mirror and sees this, but we asked the staff for a big chunk of money and there it is. We didn't need it. So I'm going to say it again, even do silence here, that we should give it back. Sorry, we should. That's it. Thanks.
Well, I'll comment on that. I actually, and I'll talk more about other things later, but I actually think that's something that should be a board discussion. So if, perhaps we can put that on the agenda for our June meeting, because we did, staff relations are important. We did get significant concessions and they weren't needed. So what do we do with them? So I think it's certainly, I think it's a good point, Dr. Thorwart, and I think it's worth discussion. So we hear from all the board members about it. Does anyone object to having that discussion on our agenda, our next meeting agenda?
I would ask Mr. Cox the question about how much of that is executive session, collective bargaining. I don't know the answer. No issues having the discussion.
It's a good point.
I can follow up to that point, Mr. Block.
Very good. I don't see any other hands raised. Denise was there, but then you removed it. So I'm assuming you got your question answered.
Yeah, I was just going to ask the very same question. I thought that it had come up the last time that this was expressed, and that it is a far more complicated thing and not necessarily suitable for a public discussion, but we can certainly circle back to Mr. Cox.
Makes sense. Okay, moving on.
Okay. I'm going to take a quick break and allow Dr. Fraser the opportunity to summarize the 21-22 final budget recommendation before we dive into the numbers. So Dr. Fraser, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks so much, Mr. Stone. Certainly, we are pleased this evening to be able to bring to you our final budget recommendation. We are slowly but surely inching closer to fiscal year 21-22. To frame this recommendation, I want to remind everyone that we do have long-term budgetary goals. One of those is to achieve a zero deficit budget. I presented this when we discussed the Soul Feinstone project and showed that Council Rock really has not had a zero deficit budget for just about a couple of decades now, at least 18 of the past 19 years. Other goals that we have involve us including the CIP money that Mr. Stone had referenced earlier. We pegged that at $3 million a year. We want to include that money in the operating budget instead of being dependent upon having a surplus at the end of the year in order to be able to fund those summer maintenance projects. And was also discussed at some length earlier. Another of our goals is to start including $500,000 in the budget to address future technology needs. Obviously, we bought a lot of Chromebooks this past year to go one-to-one. Those Chromebooks have a 6-year life cycle, and they will all be due for replacement at the same time. So it's really difficult, if not impossible, to evenly spread out the need to replace some of those items, as well as classroom display boards. So what we can do is begin to have these future or these budget allocations now, knowing that we'll need to address some spikes down the road, and we don't want those spikes to significantly impact any of our budgets. So future planning is certainly prudent. We are also aiming to get to the point where steady tax increases below the Act 1 index are sufficient to sustain our educational and operational excellence. And as we also just talked about, one of our goals is to earn a AAA bond rating for the district. So achieving these goals is incredibly important in maintaining our current student programming that we offer, and also down the road being able to build upon our current programming. And the budget we're recommending this evening is really with both of those in mind, and this budget takes some pretty significant steps forward in these goal areas. So this recommended budget does call for a 3% tax increase. And this 3% tax increase would afford us the opportunity to include that $3 million in summer maintenance work, and also include $500,000 in this budget for those future technology needs, while at the same time reducing our budgeted deficit from $3 million, which it is this year, to $1.25 million. This budget also establishes for the first time a pooled contingency, as opposed to historically contingency in Council Rock has existed across the various departments. So we are anticipating a net savings via this approach of $1.1 million, and I give Mr. Stone kudos for that thought. And probably most importantly, this budget results in no negative impact for any of our educational programs or any of our staffing. And it also includes a prudent introduction of ESSER funds, and Mr. Stone will explain those in more detail. So this budget certainly helps set us up for continued success in the short term as we look ahead to school year 21-22, and just as important, it helps set us up for continued success in the long term. It's important that we continue to effectively meet the needs of our kids, not only here in the short term in the coming year, but for many years to come beyond that. So that is our recommendation at a very high level. And Mr. Stone is going to go through many of the details now. So Mr. Stone, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Frazier. If it would please the board, Mr. Bialik, what I'd like to do is review the details of the 21-22 final budget, and then transition into the long-term plan model, and then have an overall conversation about those two items together, as there's, as you know, obvious interplay between the recommendations in the current year and how it affects the future. So as long as you're okay with that approach, that's what I would do.
That makes sense. Go ahead.
Okay. So here's the executive summary of that budget that Dr. Frazier just mentioned. He gave the qualitative version. This is the quantitative version. The recommended budget brings revenue in at $250.5 million, expenditures of $251.7 million, and there is that $1.25 million rounding deficit budget. Again, that was $3 million in the prior year and $4.4 million the year before that. So we will obviously, we are budgeting to use that as fund balance, or bring that deficit into balance with fund balance, and would bring the ending deficit down to zero. So many of the adjustments that we've made to the budget since we discussed the first draft back in March have been returning the revenue budget to pre-pandemic levels, as we've been able to observe almost 9 months of data and begin to forecast forward on what we think we're going to see. There's been a lot of change to local revenue. So, pardon me. So you see items such as increasing the real estate tax collection rate, increasing delinquent tax collections. You see an increase to earned income tax collections to bring us closer to levels prior to the pandemic, but still within a reasonable range of conservatism. We'll talk in more detail about the introduction of the ESSER funds. Those are the federal funds that we'll be receiving over the next 3 years, and I will demonstrate how we're planning to use those over that 3-year period so as to avoid a fiscal cliff of trying to balance the budget in 1 year with the funds. This will space it out. And we're also anticipating, due to the fact that the COVID restrictions were just very recently lifted, we've brought back in half of the revenue for events, so athletic contests, facility rentals. We brought back in half of what we would normally budget. So it's not going all the way back up to the pandemic. It should hopefully be appropriately conservative. But obviously, this most significant revenue line item over which the board has control is the real estate tax rate. And so as Dr. Fraser mentioned, the recommendation is a 3% tax increase, which generates just about $5 million, just shy of $5 million. And you can see where we started the budget, which obviously has no tax increase included in that number. We've moved it from 242.7 million, added 5 million for a real estate tax increase, and then ultimately landed at 250.5 million. Although not nearly as impressive looking in terms of the number of items, there's a significant amount of work that goes into moving from a first draft of expenditures of 255.7 down to the recommended level of 251.7. The most significant items that you'll note on here are the reductions associated with the accounting for retirements. That totals just about $1.8 million. And that is, again, the replacement of a more veteran teacher, typically at the higher end of the salary schedule, with a teacher at the lower end of the salary schedule. So there's a natural savings associated with that. We also made targeted reductions to department budgets that would have the least impact on instruction, and did so using that pooled contingency model, which I'd like to show in more detail a little bit later on in the presentation to demonstrate how that net savings of $1.1 million is generated. The 21-22 real estate tax millage rate is recommended at 134.1224 mils over the current rate of 130.216. It's an increase of 3.9 mils. And then this is also the time of year where we calculate the homestead farmstead credit for those individuals who qualify typically as for their primary residence. The basic math on this calculation is that we receive $5.65 million from the state, and we are instructed to simply pass that money back through to the taxpayers. So we divide that number roughly by the 19,432 properties that qualify for either a homestead or a farmstead, and it roughly comes out to about this number here. There's some more complicated math associated with calculating the value of an assessment change, and so the math is not precise, but the reduction this year is $290.64 compared to $283.42 for this past year. There was some concern last year with the significant drop in gambling proceeds that the state might not be able to fund the homestead credit at the levels it had been funding it since its inception. Fortunately, that's not been the case. The fund is sufficiently healthy to be able to sustain that level, because if it were not able to do that, the recommended real estate tax increase would feel much higher to taxpayers because of a significant decrease in that credit that has now become essentially an automatic reduction in taxes every year. So any decrease to the amount of the credit would make a tax increase feel much larger. We've analyzed the impact of that 3% tax increase at 3 levels. We do so just to try to demonstrate how it impacts various levels of the community using a property assessed at the 25th percentile, the median assessment in the district, and also the 75th percentile. So The impacts range when you calculate out those folks' current year taxes versus the proposal for next year's taxes. They range from between $100 to $200. And obviously some folks may be less than that 100, some folks may be more than that 200. This again is an analysis just on residential properties, and it also assumes that the homeowner qualifies for a homestead credit. This is a chart that I've shared with the board at each final budget presentation over the last several years, and demonstrates that the board has, in the last 11 years, I suppose that is, has approved budgets at or below the Act 1 index, with the exception of 1 year. This orange line is the state mandated Act 1 index, and then the tax increases are the blue lines. 2011-12, there was no tax increase, which is why you don't see a bar there. And again, the recommendation of 3% here in 21-22. Taking a more detailed view of the final budget, you can see the various sources of funds on the revenue side in the top section here, and then the various categories of expenditures. And you see several prior years of actual spending. So you'll see that that in 2018-19, there was only a surplus of $880,000. In 2019-20, there was a surplus of $702,000, but that did include about a $3 million transfer to the Capital Reserve Fund. When we compare the 21-22 budget to the 2021 budget, you see the changes in both dollars and percents in the far right columns, noting a $7.3 million or 3% increase in total revenue, which very roughly translates into $5 million for the real estate tax increase, plus those adjustments to earned income tax and real estate transfer tax to bring those numbers up to levels that we saw prior to the pandemic, or at least almost to those levels. Expenditures are increasing 2.3% or $5.6 million year over year, budget to budget. The significant increase is obviously that 3.5 million of previously unbudgeted fund transfers. So 3 million for CIP or summer projects, $500,000 to begin seed money for a technology fund to fund future year purchases. The other significant item in the budget this year compared to next is that there is a $1.8 million change in charter school tuition. That is, again, assuming that we've seen an increase in the number of students enrolled in charter schools. And so we're assuming that that rate continues, and we'll have more discussion on that topic a little bit later on. For those who prefer a graphic view of the revenue budget, you see we are a locally funded school district, 77% from local sources. That is primarily our tax base. And this is a common pie chart for school districts in this area to see most of the funding coming from local sources, only 22% from the state and federal sources, and then the use of fund balance continuing to decline as we move toward a zero deficit budget model. The expenditure budget looks similar, where salaries and benefits comprise 3/4 of the overall budget. We're a people organization. We are students and teachers and folks supporting that work in the classroom. So it's not surprising to see 75% of that budget devoted to salaries and benefits. About 15% of this slice of the pie is contributions to the employer contributions to the pension system. Those are offset again by reimbursements in this gray slice of the pie on the state side. But again, that piece of the pie on both sides of the ledger is growing. Debt service is at 7.5% of our overall budget. You see the introduction of a budgetary reserve at 0.5%, slightly lower than what we see in our peer groups. They're generally in the 1% range. So that is a prudent pooled contingency that we're utilizing there. The transfers at 1.5%, again, not previously budgeted. And then everything else in our budget, the 300 to 900 objects, coming in at about 16%. taking a very detailed look at the budgeted expenditures, comparing again 2021 to 21-22. Just a very slight decrease overall in the number of FTEs, a minus 0.5. But obviously there are increases in that in the contracts for our employees. Those salary concessions expire midway through the 21-22 fiscal year. And so there will be salary increases offset by those retirements that I discussed a few slides ago. You can see the increase in the retirement line, pardon me. You can see the increase in the retirement line item at $543,000, and that number growing now to $40.4 million on a gross basis. Total employee benefits, 72.7 million, total salaries at 115.2. And you can see the variances in the columns here, both in terms of dollars and percentages. The remainder of the budget, the 300 to 900 objects, is where you see the majority of the change, and we'll talk in more detail about that. It relates primarily to the budgeting of those transfers, but only a 0.1% increase in total salaries and benefits year over year, budget to budget. And there again, you see the 2.3% change in total expenditures. Dr. Frazier mentioned the use of ESSER II and American Rescue Plan ESSER III funds, which were approved by the federal government. In some cases, the ESSER II funds were approved actually prior to the adoption of, they were approved in December, and then more recently, the American Rescue Plan ESSER funds were approved shortly thereafter. So what I've laid out for you here is a proposal that funds two items over the next 3 years, coming from those two sources of funds. And the reason that we're proposing funding these over 3 years is that's the maximum period of time allowable under both of these programs. So just looking purely at utilizing the first available funds first, ESSER II, and then moving on to ESSER III, we are proposing utilizing the funds to pay for the summer academy that we are offering this summer to help address the learning loss that unfortunately some of our students may have experienced during the pandemic. And we estimate that to be about $150,000 per year. But the more significant recommendation is to fund the 6 tech integration specialists that work at all 3 levels with our teachers and students for the next 3 years to the tune of about $900,000 each year. These 2 years are estimates. We do not have approved collective bargaining agreements for these 2 years, so these numbers will have to be defined when that is approved, and we'll budget accordingly. But we use those funds over a 3-year period to pay for those 2 items and get very close to utilizing all the funds. We are going to utilize all the funds. We will find ways to utilize that remaining amount of money, assuming that these numbers come in as expected. But the general fund must pick up the cost of these tech integration specialists once we hit the fiscal year 2024-25. So they're going to be funded with federal dollars and then have to come back on the books in 24-25, the next in 3 fiscal years. So I just want to make sure that the board is well aware of that. That must happen if the tech integration specialists remain a priority. So this is the common graph that I show about the PESER's employer contribution rates, showing that back in 2003-04, sorry that I continue to do that, 3.77% of budgeted salary costs being contributed to the PESER system. Now we've reached 34.94% on a gross basis. The expenditure budget, if contributing 3.77% on 21-22 expenditures, could be reduced by $36 million. Now that is again a net reduction of $18 million due to the state share. We would have to reduce 50% of that contribution amount on the revenue side. But $18 million is a significant amount of money, and could be utilized for a number of educational initiatives could be utilized to increase that fund balance that we talked about and have more money in reserves to improve the debt rating so that we could decrease borrowing costs. Here's a summary of the other major expenditure changes outside of the salaries and benefits line items. And you can see that the two most significant are those fund transfers that are now being budgeted for the first time instead of utilizing surplus if and when there was surplus. And then you see the $1.8 million of additional charter school tuition. Mr. Frederickson noted that the operating budget includes the necessary server upgrades. So that's why there's an increase in the software line item. There are some line items that decrease. The rental line item, because the district no longer has a lease with the Law School Admissions Council, that line item decreases. There's an increase in custodial services due to COVID protocols. There's an increase in the books and periodicals budget due to the planned refresh of social studies and world language textbooks. And then some reductions in MBIT tuition, again, due to our prior year tuition credit and lower prospective enrollment. A reduction of $230,000 in the repairs and maintenance budget, which is a direct result of working in that pooled contingency model. And you'll note that all other objects within that 300 to 900 category total $47.7 million, but change only by a decrease of $186,000. So there are pluses and minuses within that, none of which are significant enough, greater than $250,000 to merit specific call out here on this list. And you can see some of those accounts that don't have major changes. So the special education budget is relatively flat. Same for transportation services. There's no increase in the debt service budget. It remains at $18.8 million, which has been off discussed. And then supplies and equipment remain, again, relatively stable with variances plus or minus, depending on specific budgets. But generally speaking, no significant change. So this is a demonstration of how the pooled contingency or budgetary reserve works and shows what was originally budgeted when department members submitted their budgets in January, and then shows the amounts reduced during the budget process to arrive at what is now the recommended final budget. So you can see, for example, the operations budget came in requested at $8.6 million. We've made reductions of $800,000 to bring that budget down to $7.7 million. So what we are trying to do with a pool contingency is align the budgeted amount more closely with either the average annual spending or the maximum annual spending. So we will take data over the last 5 or 6 years and come up with an average spend in the overall budget, and then try to remove any of that, as much of that cushion as possible, so that we have a lean budget that is reflective of what is needed and projected at that time. Now, obviously, there are a number of items in that budget in particular that are not predictable. We cannot predict the temperature, we cannot predict snow, so we can't control utilities, we cannot control snow removal costs, we can't control what equipment might break down. So obviously, there's a need to have some amount of money for that reserve. So as we worked to bring these numbers down to a level more in line with these numbers, you take those reductions, but you have to add back the fact that you're including that reserve, and that gets you down to that net impact of just shy of $1.1 million. There are a few other items on here that I didn't call out because they're less significant. But I also want to point out that, certainly every budget has more money that they want to spend or that they could spend, and technology is no different. But we have, even with a very fine commitment to follow the model of budgetary reserve, we are still making investments in technology, more so than we have in years past. You see an increase of almost $1 million in the budget year over year, and significantly ahead of the average spend. And that's an intentional move to make sure that we are making those investments in the technology budget, and that this number does include that $500,000 commitment to transferring to the capital reserve fund. So with respect to the discussion that we had when I presented the after I presented the proposed final budget, the recommended option that we just walked through does include that 3% real estate tax increase and a full commitment to the transfers, and a very just general summary of that budget here, showing you that the deficit surplus coming in at $1.25 million. There is an alternate option that I'm not presenting in detail, but I have summarized below here, that would only increase the real estate tax rate by 1.99%. And how we would reach that goal is to reduce the commitment, the initial commitment to the transfers, commensurate with the reduction in the real estate tax rate. So we move from a 3% tax increase to just about a 2% tax increase here. We would make a similar reduction to the CIP and tech equipment transfer. It's just about a 1/3 reduction. So the CIP transfer would go from 3 million to 2 million, and the tech equipment transfer would go from 500,000 down to 350,000. We would also make a very small tweak to the budgetary reserve amount just to bring it down. This number is a very intentional carryover from the last year's budget. We would simply round it down to $1 million. And we would also just make a further reduction to healthcare costs, bringing the expenditures down by $300,000. It's my recommendation that based on the budget reductions that we reviewed as a leadership team, that it would be unwise to keep these transfers, which are new to the budget, in the budget if we were then going to propose any kind of staffing or program reductions. So my recommendations to any reduction to the real estate tax increase would come by reducing the amount of those transfers, reducing the amount of the budgetary reserve in lieu of making any of those programmatic or staffing changes. So again, just in response to some of the discussion that we've had around the surplus and that money was found, I just want to make it clear up front that there are things in the budget, we make assumptions, and there are significant variables that could contribute to a surplus in 21-22, because there are many factors outside of our control, and I just want to be as transparent as possible about why we might see that surplus. So certainly, if the budgetary reserve is not fully utilized or utilized at all, if we have a year of no snow, if our equipment, knock wood, does not break down, and we don't need to tap into funds in excess of those budgeted, that would go into unassigned fund balance if it were not fully utilized. If charter school enrollment moves back towards pre-pandemic levels and that $1.8 million increase is not as high, that's going to contribute to a surplus. If for some reason, very unlikely, if the funds were not transferred into the capital reserve fund, then that would obviously have a significant impact on surplus. And then what's not noted here is that all of the just various differences in revenue, if revenue comes in higher or lower than higher than expected in this scenario, we would have a surplus. And all these combinations of factors are why this is a complicated process, and as it's not, I don't want to say it's an imprecise action, but you're using the best available data that you have in order to make these decisions. Conversely, there might be a deficit if we utilize that budgetary reserve, if we have students move into the district who have exceptional special education needs that were not anticipated, if we have a particularly heavy snowfall year, just anything that's not anticipated, if charter school enrollment goes up, if revenues do not remain at pre-pandemic levels, if there is some kind of economic downturn, That would mean that what we have assumed in the budget might not translate into a surplus or even break even. It could result in a deficit. So just a reminder that to the community that we do have the budget at crsd.org email address that remains active. It gets sent to the board as well as Dr. Frazier and myself for review. So if folks have any comments about the final budget prior to its adoption on June 3rd, they can be sent into that email address, and it is monitored. And I'm going to now transfer into the financial planning model. So I'm going to close down the PowerPoint quickly and move over into the model. So bear with me for just one moment, please.
Mr. Bilek, can we take a quick second for questions, or do you want to keep pushing through?
Bill asked if we would do both of these combined, and then we can open it up for discussion and questions.
Okay, just keep notes. Thanks.
Okay. So this is an interim update to the 5-year financial projection model. Again, this is traditionally updated on an annual basis in a more thorough way to account for all the various assumptions in the model. But this update was necessary after our discussion at Finance Committee to come to some common understanding of what the significant assumptions in the plan are, which we did at the last Finance Committee meeting, and I've built in what I believe are reflective of the board's overall position on long-term planning. But the second thing that's been done is to make sure that we're utilizing an up-to-date starting point. So what the model can't always do is recognize that we anticipate a surplus in 2021, and then we have that as a starting point for all of the percentage change assumptions that are built into the model. If it's not starting at the most accurate starting point, then there can be pretty significant variances either up or down if that's not trued up. And the same is true now for the fact that we've presented and recommended in one of two budgets for the upcoming year that would also influence those future projections. So that was the reason why we were able to take this interim update and we're able to lock the model into to that point in time. But I just want to remind the board that this is not a full-scale review of the plan. I did not review every single assumption that's included. I left most of them as they were from prior to the pandemic. But the starting points were the most critical points. So, for example, we had significantly reduced the earned income tax revenue budget, but that's now been corrected and moved back up. So those future increases are based on what we believe are most current numbers rather than the pre-pandemic or early pandemic point in time. I also want to remind the board of the concept of materiality. So the 5-year projection model is not precise budgeting. It does not take individual employee salaries and model them out over 5 years. In fact, when we look at salaries, I'll note that we have 4 years in this model where we do not have collective bargaining agreements. So that makes for a significant level of uncertainty in the plan. So what you're looking at is trajectories. You're looking at the fact that based on what we've put in the model, what we've agreed to as sort of a standard starting point, that we should not necessarily quibble with the difference between borrowing 26.7 million of CIP versus 25.7 of CIP, because that's not going to have a truly material impact on the model. I will point out those items that do have a material impact on the model and can show you how those move and change. So let me start by first talking with you about what those assumption modifications were. So I mentioned the starting point. So we are now able to start the model with the expected surplus for the current fiscal year, 2021, and then also the recommended final budget at that 3% real estate tax increase for 21-22. So we actually have 2 years of data hard-coded into the plan, which gives us a more accurate starting point. And essentially, this turns into now a 4-year model. So in the fall, the plan would add the actual numbers in and then add another year to the end. So that would make for that 5th year. So I'm going to zoom into each of these tables to show the impact here. So what you're looking at are, if the plan were to play out exactly as it is laid out in this the model, these would be the tax increases in the updated plan, and these numbers are calculated as obviously the starting point of 3% is what was recommended just a few moments ago, but these future year increases are based on the Independent Fiscal Office, which is a statewide organization that projects various economic data at the state level. The IFO makes a projection of where it thinks the Act 1 index will be in future years. This number is calculated as that projection minus 1%. So this is in 2023, for example, the IFO has projected that the Act 1 index will be 3.7%, but the model assumes that the board increases the real estate taxes by 2.7%. And again, I'll be able to show you what that differential translates into on a future slide. Same is true in these future years. There's also, as we discussed, an increase to the assessed value of all property in the district. So there is just a 0.1%. Again, we're talking about billions of dollars of assessed value. So 0.1% is still a fairly substantial increase. Moving over to the labor table, again, I mentioned that this table includes estimates for the majority of the percentages that you see on the salary growth line items, and there are 4 years of costs that are not included in the CREA unit or the CRESPA unit because there is no approved contract. And this includes 2 items. Again, we start with, there's an assumption of 20 retirees per year. So those 20 folks drop out of the top salary, Masters plus 45, move into the new higher salary, and then move into the average group as those folks who are in the average group move to the top of the salary scale. So again, it's not precise budgeting for each individual employee, but is intended to show the progression of costs through the salary line item. These salary increases, I do point out, would need to include both step movement as well as new money that's added to the salary schedule. So this would be what we would call an all-in salary cost for each of those line items. And then the last significant assumption that we discussed is CIP. And this CIP budget includes the model includes a $3.5 million annual transfer each year, and then also assumes a $27 million borrowing for for the deferred CIP as well as MBIT's projects. And you can see in this table here a breakdown of how that looks. So you see that there are certain projects that are eligible for borrowing, and these clock in at 14, 17 and a half, about 20 million. Make sure I have that number right. It's going to be, that's going to be about $22, $24 million. There are other CIP projects, including those that have already been approved by the board at $3.25 million, and the first year of MBIT at $196,000 that will be cash funded, and they'll be funded in the summer of 21, which falls into the 21-22 budget year for the model. And then there are other costs that are cash funded that remain in the capital reserve fund. And then you see the amounts of the MBIT projects over those 5 years. Mr. Hidalgo asked a question about the whether we were using the $500,000 in the operating budget. But you can see what happens over time if there is a commitment to funding $500,000 per year. You can see how that technology bucket would grow substantially to be able to start to offset some of those general fund operating costs. And I also mentioned a small reserve in for transportation equipment upgrades. One thing that I did not point out in my discussion on the property taxes is that these numbers are higher than what we had in the last plan that we discussed. So the last plan that we had presented had tax increases of about 1.6% in years 23 through 25, and then about 2.3% in 2026. So these are higher than what we had previously. Okay, so this table is what we typically look at when showing the overall plan. And again, it's a summary of all of the inputs into the plan. And I'll just briefly expand a couple of the items here to show all of the inputs that are going into the model to calculate out that total revenue. So what you're seeing is what we've referred to again with the what we used in the fall update of the plan as the status quo scenario, which I think is representative of kind of where we are as an organization. Of this is representative of not really. It's representative of what most likely will actually happen, and that it also shows that we're committing to what we have in place right now. There aren't new initiatives added. Really the only substantial investment included in this plan is towards CIP and towards the facility improvement projects. The reason that this most closely resembles what we know is if you look at the 21 budget column, you'll see that there's the transfer out to the new debt service fund in this line item here. And then the remainder going into fund balance, $6.1 million. So our starting point being 29.1 million. And then this column represents the budget recommended for 21-22, that 250.5 million and 251.7 million in expenditures. And there's your $1.2 million deficit, reducing at the end of next year, reducing that budget down to, or the fund balance down to $27.8 million. So I will close that and just roll down to, this is a graphical representation of what you're seeing here. So you see that there's a surplus in 2021, revenues on the blue line greater than expenditures, a smaller deficit, but still a deficit, revenues less than expenditures, blue line versus red line. And then you can see that the expenditures increase to this extent and the revenues at this extent, again, based on those assumptions that we had in the model. This chart to the right here shows the net operating result, which is the orange line. So again, there's your positive 6.1 million and then negative numbers into the future, and then your fund balance amount. So if I roll back up to the table and zoom in, you see this net operating result line item is the reduction in the general fund balance, or otherwise known as the deficit that we would see. Again, all things equal in the plan happening exactly as projected. That's what we would see. Now, what we can do in the model is also show, because we recommended a 1.99 alternate option, is I can turn on what that will look like, which So you'll see a reduction to revenue, a slight reduction to expenditures, and very similar, a very similar change, or a very similar deficit noted right here. But what is most significant is that the taxes decrease over the long term. The ability to generate revenue decreases over the long term. So if you focus on that deficit line item, and I change back to the expected case here, which is simply just terminology, you'll see that it will update. I hope. Sometimes it's a little picky. It's a little finicky right now. It's not updating, but what you would see is that the decreases in fund balance are more dramatic in this scenario where there's only a 1.99% real estate tax increase, demonstrating that going from what was a minus $10 million fund balance to a minus 16 is substantial. So I'm going to switch over to the capital reserve fund just to show the impact of committing $3.5 million to that fund over time. And then I'm also going to turn on the borrowing for CIP and MBIT. So you see here a pretty substantial deficit, which I really need to get that to update. This is being a little picky, forgive me. There we go. So what you saw is that with that commitment of $3.5 million each year and borrowing $27 million, you get to a place where you've caught up. But I know that Mr. Taylor has expressed that $3 million is not sufficient to stay ahead of the backlog. That number needs to be more like $4.5 million per year. So even in this situation, we would still grow the backlog and basically just maintain sort of a status quo situation. So again, just graphically here, you're seeing that status quo. So what I would like to do is transfer over into how we can make adjustments to the plan, just to show some of the impact of both tax increases as well as including educational initiatives. So if we were to raise taxes to the maximum allowed under Act 1, which again, they're based on the current IFO projections, which are just that, they are projections based on data and going out multiple years into the future. So inherent uncertainty. And we focus on the opportunity to add the fifth special at the elementary level in the 22-23 school year. So not this upcoming one, but the following. You see on this table here that we would bring on 7.6 FTEs, which is what we estimate we would need to add that fifth elementary special. They would come on as new hires, and then those costs would increase as they moved up through the salary scale. So it's about an additional $3.5 million right there by the 25-26 school year. And again, these would be the tax increases that would be necessary if we went all the way to the Act 1 index as projected by the IFO in each of those years. So when we turn that on, you see, I'll just flip back quickly. If you focus on some of these later years of the plan, and I can zoom in on that, the revenues grow significantly over time and the deficits will decrease because there's more revenue being added into the plan. So again, I know that's happening quickly, but if you look at 250.4 going all the way out to 271.3 in the original, the status quo model, and then utilizing the forward progress, that's an additional moving out to 2026, $278.9 million. That's an additional $18.6 million over 4 years, but it's also plus 4% to those tax increases. It's an additional 1% every year. And you can see that the deficits are much smaller, and you add that fifth special, but still trending in a tricky direction. So just for those who prefer a more graphical representation, you can see again a slight increase again on $250 million. That's that's not a substantial change, but still an increase to that trajectory, and that those increases bring the revenue line up, but just not to the point where we are breaking even or covering those expenditures. And then the same thing happens in the forward progress model, where the operating result is not as substantial over the last couple of years of the plan, but still trending in that downward direction. The last slide I have in the model here just shows again that as an overall analysis of the fiscal health of the district, that fund balance declines in the status quo model, that line item right there, even in the forward progress model, where we're raising taxes to the maximum extent possible and beginning to add where we add the fifth special. Just as an example, we still remain, sorry about that, we still remain below our projected ratio or target of 5%. You see it going down there, and well below our peer group, which we have set at 15%. And to Mr. Block's earlier question, this is a copy and paste right out of the April 9th bond rating report that we received from S&P. That drawing down fund balance is the risks lowering the bond rating lowering the bond rating, which would increase borrowing costs. But the upside scenario is that if we have more years where we're conservative in our approach and the fund balance comes in higher, then we might be able to raise the rating. But they don't use will, they use could. So it's not a certainty by any stretch of the imagination. So thank you for the opportunity to go through both of those at once. I think it was appropriate to bring the two, the current and the long-term together in one analysis. But I know that there's probably a lot of questions on both of these. So I'm going to transition back over into the PowerPoint, and we can discuss the current budget and the long-term plan at your convenience.
So before you move off of this, I think you missed that the bottom left with the bond ratings. There's been a lot of discussion about bond ratings. Can you just talk about this a little bit?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the Moody's, which is the other major bond rating agency in school finance, which we do not have a rating from, but they provide a more practical tool to demonstrate the impact of, they call it their scorecard, where you can plug in inputs and it will generate your approximate bond rating. Again, it's nothing official, but this shows that the district would be rated an A1 with Moody's as of 2021, and that bond rating would begin to decline. Again, purely based on quantitative factors. And without any intervention on any other front in terms of revenue enhancements or expenditure reductions. This is, again, just based on that information. So forgive me for overlooking that.
Thank you.
Okay, I will flip back over to the slideshow. Did that happen? Are we back on the blue PowerPoint now?
Okay, Mr. Block, you had a question. Did you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Bialik. I had two from the PowerPoint, but just to the model, you referenced salary assumptions, tax assumptions. Glad to see you use the 2021 finish. You didn't touch healthcare, or at least if you mentioned it was included in salaries. Is that meaningful here in terms of the model if there were to be changes in healthcare contributions or experience?
Depending on the level to which those changes occur, the total healthcare contributions are about $22 million. So for every 10% change, it would be $2.2 million in either direction. So 1% would be 220,000. So it could have a significant impact if there were substantial increases or decreases. Yes.
Okay. And then back to the comparison, you are showing the 2021-22 budget versus the 2021 budget and the differences in spending. Not for tonight, we don't need to go back and look at both slides, but what would be helpful for me as I start to consider the options here and my position, it would be great to see a comparison similar to what you did in the model of the 2021-22 budget versus the expected actuals this year. So we're truly looking at how we finish against what our position is next year. I think, historically we've looked at the budgets, which is good. But we've always had, 1 to 2%, which isn't a lot to your point, variance. So I think taking a look at actuals is also helpful when determining which route we want to take.
Yeah, I did try to have the model approximate that, but it's not very easy to do. It essentially requires me to make assumptions that I wouldn't build into the budget overall. So I wouldn't have faith in the output that it provided. I can certainly do the comparison.
No, sorry, Bill. I didn't mean for you to change the model. I'm just talking about the comparison in the PowerPoint slide where you showed 21-22 budget versus 2021 budget and the changes in spending.
Okay.
Just that column, and it would be helpful for me to take a look at a comparison of the recommended budget versus, and just put actuals for 2021 in there, just so we can get that view as well, right?
Okay, so yeah, I think I understand where.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
So where you have 2021 budget,
yep.
It would be helpful to see a comparison of the 21-22 budget against the 2020-21 forecast. So then that way it's a more realistic picture of the changes in spending, and it'll help inform that question about what a tax increase or not one or different ones could look like.
I understand.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Block. Joe, Mr. Hidalgo.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Can you guys hear me? I'm not sure.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Really, you're just hitting your stride, and I'm really going to be sad to lose you. The district's going to be sad to lose you. I just was wondering with this software, something I think I'd like to take the time to take a look at personally, if I have a chance with you or somebody, learn it a little bit more, maybe slide around on the scales and look at the different scenarios, because what I'm finding hard to reconcile is the projections that are always coming up that show, negative fund balance in 3, 4, 5 years. And so, one question I have is, and I think it's kind of to what Mr. Block just was asking, you can't plug in actual data and model out the previous 5 years because you have to pick assumptions, right? But is there any benefit, and I'm sure you may have tried that, can you actually plug in historical data for a certain number of years and then project out for the other couple, let's say last 3?
I don't, the model certainly has historical data in it, but it doesn't It doesn't have the capability, to my knowledge, to be able to take a change or a variance between budget and actual and push that forward throughout the remaining projections. It does use either a 1 or 2 year starting point. So 2021 actuals and 21-22 budget. That's the extent of what I believe the model can do. That doesn't mean that it can't do it, and I just don't know how, but it's I don't think it's possible.
Well, yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I feel that this is a useful tool. I just need to try to figure out where the disconnect is with actuals and the models, because it seems like, you know, with conversations, we always end up better than we project. You know, we've had that deficit budgeting for many years, and now we're transitioning. So things are kind of not clear. But, you know, I think what you're saying with even the top Act 1 projected index tax increases, we're still looking at a dire situation from a projection standpoint anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a projection, and there's lots of things that could change one way or the other. And I acknowledge that I am inherently conservative in how I project. If I'm going to make an assessment of revenues, I'm going to probably go a little bit lower than just by my nature, and would do the same on expenditures. You would very likely find that of all business managers. So yes, I understand the difficulty in reconciling it, but this is, you know, we've affected the major assumptions in this model. We had the discussion last month, and I got input from the board on what what the numbers would what inputs we wanted to put in, and this is what the model is saying. So, you know, I look at this, and you know, I obviously have some concerns about the trajectory. You know, as I've said a number of times, we will intervene to the best that we can and make recommendations that don't allow this to happen. But absent some structural change in the revenues and expenditures, then we do have to, you know, we do have some significant planning that needs to take place.
I appreciate that, because that was my gut instinct when I came on the board a few years ago in 2018. So, you know, sooner or later, this may or may not catch up to us. But I really appreciate all the work you've done, and tonight's presentation was fantastic. So, and all the little nuances, the things you're doing as a business manager are really well appreciated, much appreciated. Thank you. I'll let others talk now.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Mr. Solomon had his hand up next.
Thanks, Mark. I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to hit a couple people. Mr. Frederickson, how many Chromebooks are you estimating are aging out this year that we need to buy additional ones?
Roughly 4,000.
You said 4,000, correct?
Yes, sir.
And how many did we buy last year?
I don't have the exact number, but it was several thousand. We're actually still waiting for 1,092 to come in.
We spent about $628,000 last year in Chromebooks, correct?
Yes, sir.
We're waiting on Chromebooks. The $1 million cut to your budget, Mr. Frederickson, what exactly is that?
So what I'm doing this year is I'm replacing, there are a couple of things that are aging out in the buildings. For example, the interactive whiteboards.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that money is for doing a full-scale replacement of interactive whiteboards across the district. This year in the operations budget, what I have is to replace half of the interactive whiteboards at both of the 2 high schools this year. And then my plan is to replace the other half next year. And then the year after that, we'll do the elementary schools, budget willing, of course. The other thing that was cut was just some cybersecurity products that I wanted to put in place They're not drop dead essential. They'd be really nice to have. I'd sleep better at night if we had them, but
Sure.
they can wait another year.
Has anything been leveled out after what was cut from you last year? Or are you still wanting in that area as well?
Now, I think this year, with the addition, and my budget is significantly higher this year than it was last year.
Right.
Because we need to replace some of the infrastructure equipment, we can't wait any longer.
Sure.
That's what we're doing this year. And then we'll have a little bit more breathing room, but there are, every year things die and they get older. And,
I get it.
I think the addition of the capital, the set aside funding that Bill's put in the budget, I think will help in the long term. I mean, it's going to take us a couple years to get there, but eventually it will be leveled out.
No, I think it's smart. I totally agree with you, Matt. I think that's probably too many years in the should have happened years ago, but we're not here to talk about that. I like the room that it gives everybody a little bit of breathing room. I don't know if Dr. Frazier should answer that, or I have a question. The tech specialists, sir, why aren't they built into the operating budget at this point, and we're relying on the ESSER funds?
I'll answer that, Mr. Salomon. They were built into the operating budget. We just simply elected to utilize the ESSER funds to pay for them. So it's not that they weren't going to be funded, but having the opportunity to pay for them for 3 years with federal money gives us budgetary relief at a time when we need it, and does so in a 3-year manner, so that it's not just simply plugging a 1-year hole. We're able to fund these folks for 3 years. One of the, we've discussed the tech integration specialists on several recent budgets, and whether to continue to include them. And, this gives us the opportunity to make sure that we fully contemplate and have the 3 years to fully contemplate their value and their continued inclusion in the operating budget once the federal monies expire.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody out there expected the pandemic to happen the way it did. But, from my sense and the people I've spoken to, the tech specialists have been, tremendous resource for our staff, not only this year, but getting us in front of this year, and they'll be huge beyond that. I personally don't know if it's something we can ever get rid of. That's why I'm asking why we're not considering them in the general budget. I think that's all my questions for now. I'll let another colleague jump in there. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Thorward had his hand raised next.
Thank you. I'm going to segue right off of what Mr. Salomon said. It's unfortunate, and maybe I can influence it, that there's any reduction in a tech budget. Frankly, Mr. Frederickson's probably grinning, but I'd like to see a clean double there, because we've shown where the money needs to be spent. And we've talked, even today, how do we form a budget that doesn't impact the classroom? And I would state without any question that technology impacts the classroom. And so I'd like to see the money, all the money restored for tech, take it out of somewhere else. Mowing the lawn doesn't impact the classroom, but we spend money on it. There's got to be something. I use that as an example, and not as where I'm telling you to go, but there's got to be something else we can cut instead of tech. And I'll take that a little further and ask, I guess, Mr. Frederickson, but maybe Mr. Stone. We're talking about a cyber option here in the fall. You're going to need staff. Do you have enough staff? Bill, is there enough staff to support the technology that goes with this cyber option going forward? And if it's Mr. Frederickson, then Matt. I don't care who answers that.
Well, I'll allow Mr. Frederickson to comment on the technical staff, because I presume that's the question you're asking.
It is.
Support, yeah. So
yes.
So I don't know, Robert, what do you think?
So, Dr. Thorward and the rest of the board, I will be including some information in tomorrow's weekly update respective to this issue. And I would suggest that we hold off on this conversation for the time being until I have a chance to socialize some of that info.
I am, Dr. Fraser, I am perfectly happy with that. My further comments, Stan, I want to see, we seem to be embracing technology, and this year has kind of shown us we have to. I don't want to see Chromebooks on top of every desk every day, but I just want to be mindful. And to second Mr. Salomon's comments about the tech specialists, it's no secret how I feel about them. I'm glad they're included. I'd like them to be part of the regular budget too. Although to Mr. Stone's point, I get where and why we chose to use the funds we did. Makes sense. I got it. So thank you.
Dr. Thorwart, thank you. Mr. Hidalgo, did you have another question or comment?
No, I'll put my hand down. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else?
Unless we need guidance on taxes or something like that.
We're getting there. Thank you, Joe. Mr. Tate has a comment or question? Mr. Tate?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bialik. I too have been supportive of increased spending on technology for a number of years. That's clearly been a bit of a weakness in terms of what we've been able to do budgetarily. The tech specialists obviously have been irreplaceable, and whether or not they're funded from the ESSER funds or the general budget, I don't think matters. It's clear that they've established the necessity of having them. One of the things that we were just looking at was a reduction in the CIP spending, which is set at $3 million. Mr. Taylor has said that that's barely enough or insufficient to keep us up with deferred maintenance to try to catch up. If we were to reduce that $3 million CIP allocation, I think we're really really asking for big problems with our physical plan. And while we don't want to make cuts in programs that are directly in the classroom, if we have classrooms that are leaking or HVAC systems that fail, we can't really teach effectively. So I'm very concerned about any reduction in that CIP line item. I think $3 million is the bare minimum of what we ought to be doing. That's my comment for now.
Thank you, Mr. Tate. Anyone else? Okay, I'll comment if there's no one else. So, you know, I've been concerned for a number of years, as you've all heard me say, and some folks have been critical about my concern. It's not. I don't feel better after seeing this presentation. So, the comparison of actuals concerns me. We're coming out of and continuing, at least maybe this year, 11 years of unprecedented growth in the United States. So I think back, you know, we all look at the PACERS contribution and we're beside ourselves, and we get very upset about what happened with PACERS. And this goes back to the end of the 1990s, and PACERS really started to become, well, it was a problem already, but what happened at the end of the 90s was the folks in charge of PACERS never thought that the party was going to end. The market had been roaring. They voted to increase their own benefit. When I say they, I'm talking about the state legislators. They voted to increase their own benefit, and along with those benefits, everybody else in the system. So, and we're paying for it now, and we complain about it, and this potential FBI investigation aside, we've all been blaming Harrisburg for years with the PACERS crisis, and it all goes back to them, like I said, thinking the party was going to never end. And I see that at least our district doing the same thing. we're saying, well, you know, for the past 11, 12 years, we've been operating at a deficit and it's all worked out, and that's all great until it doesn't. And I think Bill's assumptions are spot on, and they're what we told him to use. This board collectively, nobody disagreed. Nobody said that we said Bill used these assumptions, and we're looking at deficits of $10 million, $6 million, and you know, these are deficits we can't have, and the only interventions are, you know, that I understand the word intervention, but the only interventions are close buildings, cut staff, cut programs. And Ed Tate's right, Mr. Tate is right, Mr. Thorwart's right. We need more money to go in the CIP, no doubt about it. Doug's been telling us that for years. We need more money to go into technology. We need more money to go into staffing. We need more money, but we don't have it. And I'm very concerned of the health of our district. And I would hope at some point that my fellow board members will join me in this, more of my fellow board members, because we need to get our house in order. We need to really be realistic. Look at these numbers and let's figure out a way to close that gap. I don't know the answer to it, but I know it's not additional spending. I know it's not pausing and taking a look at, you know, I'm not going to relitigate the discussion about Sol Feinstein, but you know, it would have been a great opportunity to pause, get our house in order, and see where we end up. We cannot count on history to save us. Returns of what we've had in the history to save us. Can't do it. You know, Mr. Hidalgo and I are financial planners. We would never allow these kind of projections to live in a financial plan for our clients, and we shouldn't do it for our school district. It greatly concerns me. I have Bill, I have a question regarding the one specific regarding the plan, the assumptions, the 5-year plan. Can you go back to the salary assumptions, please?
Yes. You're seeing the model? Yeah.
There was a year in there, 2023, that had a 4% increase in salary. And I understand that these are years outside of the current bargaining agreement, and we have a significant increase in that year. 4%, 4.1% is what I'm seeing there. Can you tell me why that jumps up there, please?
Yeah, best answer is that you know, these are just what I've anticipated to be the cost of the contract for 22-23. I think further discussion is best, you know, reserved for executive session as it relates to bargaining.
Very good. I'll accept that. Okay, that's I just have to reiterate, we cannot act like that pension board in the legislators in Harrisburg. We can't allow the thought of the party going to continue to drive our decisions about the district. We have to look at these. These are not worst case scenarios. These are, Bill used, I wrote it down, a representative of what most likely will happen. And that's with a 3% tax increase this year and the 1% off of the IFO projections for the remaining years. And it greatly concerns me. I won't be on this board in a few months, but I'm still going to live in Council Rock, and I want it to be a viable district and a viable community. We are all linked together. That's all I have for now. I see some other hands up. Dr. Thorwart, did you have another? Excuse me, Dr. Thorwart, did you have another comment?
Yeah, just real quick, and it's more in defense of Mr. Stone than a comment. Yeah, and you kind of summarized it, Mark. I mean, these models only say exactly what we tell them to, and we pay our financial guy to be somewhat pessimistic. If you were rosy, Bill, I'd have a problem. This is the right way for you to do this, and that's not for me to say or suggest that things are going to come up roses, but these conservative plans are much more realistic and much more digestible to a $250 million business than saying everything is going to come up unicorns and rainbows later. So I just wanted to stick in, Mr. Bialik, that, to Bill's point, these models are exactly what we told them to be. They're giving the exact answers they should give because we told them what the inputs were. And that's okay. So I like the fact that Mr. Stone is somewhat conservative. We've had other financial business managers here who were even more conservative. That's okay too. But I don't want to in any way say that Mr. Stone's Dr. Doom here with this. This is pretty realistic, and it's exactly what we told him to do. So I'll stop there.
Great. Ms. Brooks?
Thanks. I just want to address, just some of how we're looking at this. I mean, some people are using the words dire and whatever. I just want to say I appreciate the conservative view because we have to take this very, very seriously. I do disagree with language like we need to get our house in order. I think our house is in order. I think we've been very good caretakers of our house. And, the best way that we demonstrate how well we take care of our house is by these exercises and these projections and being very thoughtful, understanding that, we can't trust the projections 5 years out in the same way we can in like the immediate couple of years. I don't, you say you would never let these projections live like this. I'm in your business, and I don't know your industry and how that works. But I mean, the reality is 5 years ago in 2016, the 5-year projection had our current year with a fund balance of -$7 million. So we're what, $36 million better off now than what that projection said. But it just goes to show that the 5-year projection is one tool that we use to protect the district and make sure that we're doing the very best we can in investing to make sure that we don't have to cut programs. We don't have to cut staff. We don't have to worry about the future of our buildings and deferring maintenance. And so if anything, anyway, thank you for all of the important data points that help us understand how we make decisions moving forward. I don't know if we're moving into this conversation, but it does underscore for me, the need to keep the investments going to mitigate some of the things that we may see, stay on track for the things that we've planned, the commitments we've made, the things that we want to do. And I would support that 3% increase.
Thank you. Anyone else? Bill, do we want to go into that conversation about how everybody feels about tax increases at this point?
Sure. I'll go back to that slide for everyone's benefit. Okay.
So before we move on, I'm sorry, but I don't like to go back and forth, but I just feel like I have to reiterate that the conversation about the 5-year tax or 5-year projections from 5 years ago, I'll repeat, we've had unprecedented growth over the past several years, certainly within those 5 years. And in my opinion, and to expect that to continue is irresponsible. These projections assume pre-pandemic levels of revenue plus increases. So this assumes no slow economy, no recession, no blips along the way at all, which is it's just unsustainable. So I apologize, but I just couldn't let that comment go. All right, Bill. Sorry about that. Moving on.
That's okay. I'll just, I suppose I'll kind of kick off the discussion that the recommended option is the 3% real estate tax increase, a full commitment to the transfers of $3.5 million. And then that is made in the spirit of recognizing that there are significant expenditures, both that we've committed to and that we would like to commit to in the near future to move this district forward. And in order to do so, the most significant controllable factor is real estate taxes, whether you like it or not. That is how this district is able to drive revenue. We cannot raise the price of widgets in the middle of the year when we're having a tough sales season. That's just not how the district is able to operate. So that is why we make a recommendation for the full amount of revenue and fully commit to those transfers to be able to ensure that the impacts of future deferred backlogs of CIP are mitigated, and that there is the possibility to invest in technology equipment and not have significant increases to the operating budget to have these monies set aside. The alternative option at a lower real estate tax increase just reduces those commitments to transfers again, because it's difficult in my opinion to add transfers that did not exist in prior budgets at the expense of any negative impact to educational programming or staff. I would reduce them all the way to zero before I would begin to explore impacting education. And I think the board knows that philosophy very well. And I believe Dr. Frazier, well, I will speak for him that I believe he shares that philosophy.
So, Dr. Frazier, is it fair to say that we need some direction from the board tonight about how people feel about the tax increase? And is it also fair to say that you probably don't want to go into the next meeting with two different options, a 3% tax increase and a 1.99% budget? Would that be your preference, to be able to hone down as closely as we could one without?
It is. Yeah, the answer is yes to both of those, Mr. Bollock. Thank you.
Okay, certainly. So unless someone wants to volunteer, I'll just start going around. Does anyone want to volunteer comment beyond Ms. Brooks, who just made a comment? Ms. McKee, thank you.
Thank you. It's such an awesome responsibility that we have in terms of taxation. And I know it's not something any of us takes lightly, and we think long and hard about it. So having said that, and having really thoughtfully considered the presentation tonight, which I appreciate, Mr. Stone, I think you've made a very good argument for why we need to go to the full 3% tax increase. For all of the reasons stated, I would be supportive of that.
Thank you, Ms. McKee. This is not an anxious group to talk tonight.
I'll just go then.
Go ahead, Joe.
Though I know there's a necessity for tax increases to keep up with the ballooning expenditures, I'd like to see, I can't commit to a tax increase without seeing more almost reductions in expenditures, because I feel like at the projections we're seeing right now, we're eating up all the tax increase without maybe delivering a higher level of education, but maybe just keeping up. And I got to be careful what I say, because I'm just kind of talking off the cuff here, and I don't particularly want to offend anybody. But what I'm looking at is more the numbers and the expenditures, and looking at that 5-year plan. And that's why I thought I'd like to kind of get a 5-year tax increase program together. And I don't think we'll be able to do that in 2 weeks. So as I said, the recommendation of Bill Stone is to do a 3% increase this year. I guess that will be the 4th year that I voted on a tax budget, or a budget that had a tax increase probably close to ACT index, except for maybe the first year. And I'm trying to change our philosophy here and not just keep raising taxes and then eating it up without trying to get ahead here, and maybe we could get to that 15% fund balance. So it's all just not going to happen in the next 2 weeks. So I guess I'm just uncommitted at this point. I hope there's 5 other people to commit tonight, because I can't without seeing further work done, which can't be done in 2 weeks. So I'm kind of at a loss right now, if that makes any sense.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Mr. Tate, I thought I saw your hand up. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Mr. Bialik. Yes, I agree with what Ms. Brooks said about comment that we need to get our house in order. I mean, we work on the budget year-round, nonstop. This, of course, is a period when we put a lot more effort into looking at the budget, but we have a monthly finance committee meeting just about every month, and we pay close attention to what's going on in the budget. And if you look at the recent history, there's a lot of positive data there. We have a healthy fund balance. Our tax increases have been, on average, in the past 10 years, significantly below the Act 1 index. And at the same time, we've delivered an excellent educational product and done fairly well with our capital programs. I mean, we've got a lot of positive to look at for our, when you're looking at our financial situation, there's really a lot of positive aspects. It's troubling to look at a financial projection ahead that raises a lot of questions about where we're headed. But number one, I think at the present time, we need to make every investment that we possibly can in our academic programs, our physical plant, our technology. And I wish we could do it with a 0% tax increase. But I saw what that did to our budget. I think it was, well, there was a very limited tax increase the year before I joined the budget of about, I think it was 0.6%. And we see, well, look at 2015, look at 2014. Thank you, Mr. Stone. 2013, those, and then 2011 with a 0% tax increase. I've said this before, but it's absolutely true. That dug us a financial hole. And the first year I joined the board, we cut 40 positions. Many of those touched on the classroom. Many of those were people who worked in the classroom. They weren't teachers, they were teachers' aides, they were other support staff. But that makes a real impact. And it took a while for us to catch up. And I challenge anybody who advocates less than a 3% tax increase, tell us where they propose cutting expenditures. We look at our budget constantly. You know where we spend money. And if you can find an extravagance or somewhere to cut, let me know. I mean, we can reduce our landscaping costs. I don't think they're going to have a great deal of impact. I don't know where else to start. Do you want to talk about extracurricular programs? Do you want to talk about art or music? Where do you want to start cutting expenses? I would love if somebody could, we had a financial advisory committee that took a very hard look at our budget. And they came up with some excellent recommendations about process and procedure, about capitalized debt, about increasing, finding new sources of revenue, which is a reasonable suggestion and something we've looked at before. But that group of very smart financial people, they didn't come back to us with a laundry list of areas where we could cut expenditures. I challenge anybody on this board who wants to advocate for less than 3%, tell us where they propose to cut expenditures in a meaningful and significant way. That's my comments for now. Oh, I did. I'm sorry. Let me also ask a question Just so I completely understand, Mr. Stone, on the slide that you had up before this one, the 1.99% increase, the bullet point about healthcare costs.
Yes.
I'm not totally sure I understand exactly how that impacts, what the impact would be.
So we are, we've received a recommendation from, excuse me, from our healthcare broker to not increase rates. So the further reduction to healthcare costs would simply result in a reduction to healthcare rates by another $300,000. So relatively small on the overall plan, but still just in trying to manage that deficit to a level of between 1.25 and $1.5 million, we needed to have a further reduction to get to that point. And so that was the number that I felt was appropriate.
Got it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Tate. Dr. Thorward, did you have a comment?
Sure, I was just challenged, so I'll come in now. I'm not going to support 3% because I don't think the money's directed where it needs to go. I want it in technology, not in CIP. We can save money by selling the Chancellor Center and getting out of all the garbage that comes with maintaining a historical building. That's one place we can do it. It's long term, but if we don't force the reset, we won't get there. We can start thinking about outsourcing everything that we've insourced over the course of many years, because maybe we don't need to do them in-house. Again, I don't think this, we just went through a year where our budget ended up, I don't know, $12 million to the positive if you back out what we thought was going to be the negative. Do we need a tax increase? Do we really need a tax increase? Or did something else happen here? So I'm not going 3%. I'm not. If you want me to find places to cut, I can. We had a discussion last spring about STEM guitar. You know, there's all kinds of things we could talk about where maybe we don't need to spend the money. And little tiny incremental things add up to big money if we find lots of them, and I think we would. So if this budget would have came in with a heavy emphasis on classrooms and not hearing that half the smart boards that I see in the high schools, both high schools, where you can't really read them because they're too dim, maybe you'd get me to bite. But I'm not going to wait for a renovation to have our existing buildings up to par, and that's what I'm seeing here. So challenge me all you want. I'm not voting for 3%. So if that's not clear, I'm sorry.
Mike, can I, would you mind if I asked how you felt about the 1.99? Just to give clarity to.
I'm not real sure I can even get there unless I see the budget where we address some of these things in existing buildings, not new buildings. I don't know, Mark, to be fair.
That's fair. I'm just trying to give the administration some direction.
Understood.
Okay. Have not heard from Mr. Solomon or Mr. Block.
Yeah, I can jump in there, Mark. Thanks. I was just going to put my hand up. I'm going to echo a little bit of what Dr. Thorward just said. This question was asked about a month ago where I would start, and I think I was halfway there at 1.5, somewhere under 2. I'm happy to see an alternate option at 1.99. Coming out of the pandemic, I mean, I know people that have lost their jobs. Some of them are very close to me and happened very recently. We're talking about that we did have some, and I don't want to use the word extra money laying around, and one of my colleagues mentioned about giving it back to the staff. I'd like to give it back to the tax base that was taxed 2.8% last year, and now is looking at possibly another 3% on top of it. You know, for me, you know, I like to see my favorite restaurant have their full menu available all the time. And too many times during the last year, I've gone into the restaurant and the menu's been peeled back. You know, for me, this is a natural reset. This is the time where we should be looking at places that we can cut, and we can tailor a district that fits within the financial revenue services that we're getting that can support this. I mean, I'm concerned. I'm looking at a 12% possible increase in taxes, and I don't know where that gets us. Are we going to be better for all those tax increases? Are we still going to be paying the same amount of staff, same amount of services, and still looking at cuts in areas just to get to that budget dollar? I want to roll with the sleeves up, and I want to have that conversation because this year, like last year, we're cutting in places that, you know, I don't know how much longer you can continue to cut when the overall expenditures that we're spending on staff dollars and other places, you know, there's going to come a time where you're going to have to peel the Band-Aid off and really look at everything we're doing. It's not a shot at anyone. I think major organizations around the country are doing it as we speak. I can live with the 199. I still think there's some work there that needs to be done. The 3% with what I see, and look, those areas are good. CIP, I agree. This is a long time coming, putting money away. This pandemic for me was a 3-year thing, a 3-year rollout, 3-year plan, taxing the tax base an additional 3% on year 2 of this is not something I could support at this time. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon. Mr. Black?
Sure, Mr. Bialik, I'll be brief. I've drawn a hard line on this particular budget. The discussion tonight has given me lots to think about, and I appreciate the presentation. I appreciate the thoughts of my board. I am pleased that Soul Finestone renovation is back on the table, and that certainly weighs on my thinking. I also appreciate Mr. Tate's challenge and the comments of some of the other board members around continuing to work this budget and share some of their views about our ability to raise taxes this year. So at this point, I'm not committed to either number or any number. I'd like to spend some more time talking to Dr. Frazier and Mr. Stone around what that budget is, or what that budget is, and where their kind of tolerance levels are, and balance the fund balance number that we have now, along with Mr. Stone's approach to budgeting, to try and make the best decision I can. So at this point, I don't have a position, Mr. Bialik.
Okay, thank you. I see Dr. Frazier's hand raised.
Thanks, Mr. Bialik. I just want to comment on a couple things that have been referenced without getting caught up in any of the word choice or anything like that. There's been a lot of talk here around expenses and controlling expenses and making reductions and things along those lines. I just want to remind everyone who's tuning in this evening, the board included, that at a recent special board meeting, I had shared what our increase in expenditures are over the past 5 years, showed that relative to the 5 years before that, the 5 years before that, and the 5 years before that. And obviously inflation is something that is in the news again, and is something that is a rather constant piece. And yet our expenses, the increase in expenses over the past 5 years from the 2015-16 school year through last school year was the lowest that Council Rock has seen in over 20 years, despite the cost of goods and services going up. So I believe that perspective is worthy of mention given the discussion here this evening. Two, I just want to remind the board, I went through some of our goals earlier. Other goals, as you all know, include adding that fifth special at the elementary level that Mr. Stone talked about. Hopefully being able to delay school start times, because we know how important that is for our kids, both social, emotionally, as well as academically. Rock Block is an important initiative. So we haven't been able to add anything like that in my nearly 6 years in the district. And I don't want to go another 6 years without being able to add anything like that. And so I would ask that also be taken into consideration. And another piece is, as has been stated here this evening, we are going to miss Bill dearly. I do not want to see whoever his successor is be put into a bad spot from a budgetary standpoint. And I'm very sensitive to that. I think I would be anyway, but I'm particularly sensitive to it because I wasn't put into the greatest spot when I came to the district. Those 2 years, Mr. Tate, you referenced them earlier. There was a 0.61% tax increase that was followed by a 0.25% tax increase over those 2 years. That represented 22% of the index, and those numbers are all fine, but probably the more important piece is that our budgeted deficit went in that 2-year period from a 2.1 million deficit to a $6.4 million deficit. So there's a lot of needs here, a lot of competing needs here. And I just want to be able to speak to the past, to the future, and have a chance for those thoughts to be considered. Thanks, Mr. Bialik.
Very good. Mr. Tate, do you have your hand raised? Is that again or still?
Yeah, just real quickly, Mr. Bialik. Two things. One is shortly after I came on the board, I raised the possibility of selling Chancellor Street, and we, I believe, hired a real estate agent to help us assess the feasibility of doing so. And the conclusion was that it was not a cost-effective step to take. I wanted to revisit it, I wouldn't object, but we already have gone down that path. The other thing that I, excuse me, wanted to point out that I did not understand until maybe a couple of years ago is that foregoing a tax increase 1 year of a certain percentage is a tax increase that you are foregoing for the permanent future. In other words, you're setting the district back permanently by choosing to increase taxes at a level lower than recommended. It's almost impossible to catch up. It's a long-term impact when you choose a lower or zero tax increase.
Thank you, Mr. Tate. Any other comments? Okay, I'll give my 2 cents. So Dr. Frazier, I'm glad that you came on and had that conversation because, you know, I wonder myself what there is to cut. We haven't increased expenses for operational expenses. And in fact, we've delayed taking care of our buildings and funding technology like we should. I'm sorry to say that Council Rec's probably behind where it should be with technology, and that affects education. And I don't want Council Rec to be behind in education. So I appreciate those comments. You know, it was very difficult for me to vote to raise taxes last year. As Mr. Solomon said, 2.8% in the middle of a pandemic, but we didn't have much of a choice because things were looking pretty bleak. But it troubles me, and I'm going to walk back my statement from last meeting, honestly, because I am not comfortable at a 3% tax increase here tonight. I don't know how I'm going to feel in 2 weeks. Part of me wants to go to zero as almost just a defiant protest, because I'm so concerned about the financial future of this district, and I just feel like my voice isn't being heard, and all I have is my vote. And part of me wants to exercise that vote of saying I don't want to give the district an additional dollar until we get on track. What I think is on track, and what I think is on track may be different than what somebody else thinks is on track, but it still deserves to be heard without it's obvious to me that we have to dig much deeper into this budget, and that includes staffing, and that includes our buildings, and I don't know what the answer is, but we looked at one projection showed that we'd have to cut 144 positions to be balanced. I don't want to see that, but I also don't want to see the district in the red the way it's projected. So I'm very conflicted here. I would look at, I love the Chancellor Center, and I love Council Rock owning the Chancellor Center. You've heard me all say it before, my mother graduated from that school. It's a very important building in the borough, and I'm going to have people in the borough very upset with me by what I'm about to say, but we should look at selling that building. We should certainly look at selling the house tract. We've had an opportunity several times to build buildings on the house tract, from Newtown Middle School to elementary schools to fields and tracks, and we don't seem to even give it a thought. So I don't know how many homes could fit on the house tract, but I right now today it's a very valuable piece of property. I'm assuming. I think it's zoned conservation management, and that's one house per every 3 acres. So I think we made about $7 million when we sold the Melsky tract, and would guess it would be somewhere around there, but I'm not a real estate expert, so don't count on that assessment. But we're not going to use it, in my opinion. I don't see a situation where we will use it. So again, we've had multiple opportunities since I've been on the board. All it's done is cost us money. So there are things that we have to look at. I am not at a 3%. I'm not at a 1.99%. And counting down here, I don't know what you have, Dr. Frazier and Mr. Stone. It's a horrible place to be going into our budget meeting. I would not want to be either one of you. I'm not seeing a direction here. Mr. Hidalgo, do you have a comment?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I can't hear myself. So in response to Mr. Tate and the challenge, I will just see your challenge and raise you a challenge to look at the fact that I understand we put ourselves in a situation where a 3% tax increase, if not taken every year, is lost. So you could argue that we should just raise taxes to max every year, and we're going to be in really good financial shape. What I want to do is try to, I'm not saying you're advocating that, I'm just saying this is where we're at. It makes mathematical sense, raise taxes all the time, you won't have a problem. I challenge the people that wanted to, that went against the business manager's recommendation to slow down and take a year off, including myself to a point. I tried to meet somewhere in the middle. I have to, live with that, that basic, meet in the middle type of decision that I did. But I challenge that we need to change the philosophy on how we've been running the district. And you can look at, well, every tax increase we don't take is a loss to the future. But when we also maybe give too much in other areas, that we also there suffer, and it's compounded. Like take, for instance, compensation. Peasers goes up to 36, 37%. But the other side of the coin is it's actually a function of how much we are paying locally here. And over the last contract, it was mentioned that basically, but by the union leader publicly said that, we want, to remunerate the staff in a way that is, reflective of the area in which we live. So it could be considered the cost of living in the area, or it could just be that, hey, we're an affluent area, so we're going to pay more for the same services. And I think that's where I'm asking. It's not a nice thing to say, but the philosophy has to change. Oh, well, because not everybody here in this area, in this demographic area, is at the top. There's an imbalance. There's a big range, and I think we live in one of the best areas in the world. To be honest with you, we're very lucky here in Council Rock. I think we have a bright future, but just saying that we have to change the philosophy that just because we are a high-paying tax base, that we can afford to just pay the top notch across the world, or across the state or the country, whatever you want to say. And the last thing I want to do is cut. I do not want to cut positions at all. But what I want to do is get all stakeholders together and figure out how we can level the projections out. So basically, it's like, as Mark said, if we're not being heard, all we have is our vote. I would like to put it out there that we really all have to come together, and maybe it's just leveling things off where we can level them off. Maybe it's setting a number and saying this is what we have to live with. But I don't think we should be taking away from the classroom or the infrastructure or all that. We have to really, everybody, the taxpayer is going to have to make concessions, and so are all the stakeholders that are part of our group. And I think they did. I think you guys have. I'm talking directly to union and employees that gave back $4 million or almost $4.5 million. And we saw what the impact of that was in 1 year. And we took that money and we went ahead with some projects, which, as I said, I thought, and maybe Mr. Stone said the same thing, that $3 million is not really going to change much. And I say 3 million, Andy says 11 million, it's usually 5 million. So it's whatever, the bottom line is, as Mr. Stone said, if it's $100 we're supposed to spend and we spent 97, that doesn't mean we're out of the water. And just because the last 10 years have been great, there will be a time of recession, and hyperinflation. I mean, I think this will happen. It's a cyclical economy. And for somebody who does this every day and has been very conservative, like Mr. Stone, I can look like a fool to some people who want to see more growth when maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they were like, oh, I'm ready for that next cycle, that next 8-year downturn. So that's my 2 cents. We have to change the flow. I challenge all of us on the board to reconsider and think about a philosophical change on how we do business here. And I think I'll just leave it there if anybody wants to comment.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Tate, for the challenge.
Mr. Tate, is your hand up again or still?
No, I just didn't take it down. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Hidalgo, your hand's up. You just put it up. Do you have another comment? I'm going to take that as a no.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's okay. No problem. Mike, Dr. Thorwart.
Data point from Mr. Stone. Even at 3%, if I look at your 5-year projections, we never hit revenue equaling expenses, do we?
We do not.
Okay, just data point for me. Thank you.
If I can comment, Dr. Thorwart, that's a great point. I've and I have a clarification. Someone texted me and said it wasn't 2.8% we raised taxes by last year. It's 3.1% during a pandemic. I've discussed several times a referendum. I know we can't do a referendum now, but I'd love to hear this board talk about the validity or the value or lack of value of a referendum. There's only 2 ways we can go with this, or maybe I guess somewhere in the middle, but we could cut expenses or we can raise revenues. We're very limited to what revenues we can raise. But as I've said before, we can put it out to the district, and the district as a whole, the community can have the type of school district that they want. So that hasn't gotten much traction, if any at all. But that may be the answer to catching up the revenue to expenditures and allowing that catch up, because that's how it feels like to me. What it feels like to me is that we're really running uphill with a heavy pack on our back trying to catch up. So I don't know if anyone wants to have that discussion tonight or save it for another day since it's 10:14, but I'll just see if there's any other comments, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Stone and Dr. Frazier for wrapping up.
Mr. Bialik.
Go ahead, Mr. Hidalgo.
Oh, sorry. I myself, I'm walking away here not seeing a clear weigh-in from everybody. Are we missing just one, or are we missing two people?
Missing one. Mrs. Marcel's not here this evening.
So she'll just follow up in writing. Okay.
I will be talking there tomorrow morning, and I'm sure she'll watch the recording of this meeting as well.
Okay. And as I said, I just wanted to reiterate with what I'm saying, because it's pretty, I'm putting myself out there on a limb. I don't want to see people lose positions. Maybe if I should suggest, and I don't know if it's exec session, but maybe there's some way to not even a freeze at the top, but something, just something to curb. And what was done already, I think, came from people that were in step still, like 14 years and under. I'd like to see them continue to get the growth that they're earning. And then maybe look at Bristol. They did a complete pay freeze for 3 years because they knew what was going on economically in their school district. Is my guess. I'm not that privy to it, but I know that the last contract, I believe, they didn't take increases. And I'm going with an olive branch, trying to make everybody happy. But yeah, we can do this. My wife and I sometimes we go years without a pay increase, but costs go up every year. So we actually lose money some years. It's just the way it is for some of us. And it's not always that way for unions are well represented, and they've done very well for families and of clients of mine. And I'm pro-union. But when we get to a point where we're managing the money side of it, then we work together. And I think we can, and I think we will. And I'm asking for help from all stakeholders. And that's my last 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Dr. Frazier, do you have any parting comments?
No, just from a process standpoint, I think we heard where most folks stand. Also heard from a couple folks who aren't completely committed at this point. And of course, Mrs. Marcel isn't with us this evening. So Mr. Stone and I will do some outreach in the coming days to those folks who weren't able to commit this evening. We certainly do want to only have one budget to prepare and bring to the board on June 3rd. So we have, about 3 weeks or so, I guess, between now and then. So we will attempt to make some progress with those folks who aren't quite there yet in terms of making a decision, and see where we're at.
Yeah, and I don't want to tell you how to do your job. You probably already know this, but if it were me, I would also have a conversation with the individuals who had expressed an interest or a commitment to 3% to see if the 1.99 fits for them also, just so you get an idea of how close your numbers are.
Yeah, I think it's all the above. Thanks.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mr. Stone, any remarks before we sign off?
No, I don't. Thank you for asking.
Well, fantastic job tonight, everybody. Good conversation. Difficult time for sure. And I appreciate everybody's input. I appreciate all the work from the administration. With that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.